Welcome back, legends. You're at No Harry. Another incredible story awaits. What if Gringotts ritual found Dumbledore had sealed 40 ancient houses from Harry at birth? Subscribe and hit the bell. Let's dive right in. Chapter 1, The Ledger and the Fury. The owl arrived at 4 in the morning, which Harry thought was either very rude or very goblin. He'd been awake anyway. 16 years old today, July 31st, and Privet Drive was doing what Privet Drive always did on his birthday, which was absolutely nothing. The Dursleys had gone to bed without a word. Dudley had shoulder-checked him in the hallway and called him a freak out of something that felt more like habit than genuine malice. Vernon had locked the refrigerator, which was a new development that Harry suspected had less to do with Harry and more to do with Dudley's most recent diet. Either way, Harry had eaten a tin of crackers he'd kept under his floorboard and sat on his bed watching the orange streetlight paint the ceiling in stripes. The owl, a severe-looking creature the color of charcoal, wearing a small leather satchel stamped with the Gringotts crest, landed on his windowsill and regarded him with the particular disdain that seemed to be a professional requirement at the bank. Harry opened the window. The owl deposited the satchel, clicked its beak once as if to say don't be late, and left without accepting a treat. He untied the satchel and removed a single envelope made of something that wasn't quite parchment, heavier, slightly warm, almost like holding a very calm hand. The Gringotts seal on the back was pressed in bronze rather than wax. He broke it. Mr. Potter, you are hereby notified that Gringotts Bank, in accordance with the magical inheritance rights of 1322 and the Goblin Accord of 1689, is required to perform a full lineage and assets audit upon your 16th birthday. This audit is not optional. It is not deferrable. Your presence is required at Gringotts, London, at 9 o'clock on the morning of July 31st. Should you fail to appear, Gringotts reserves the right to conduct the audit in absentia, with all attendant findings made public record. Please note, this audit was originally scheduled for your 11th birthday, per standard Gringotts protocol. It was delayed by order of your appointed magical guardian. We do not typically note such delays. We are noting this one. Gripclaw, Senior Account Manager, House Potter Affairs, Gringotts Bank, Diagon Alley. Harry read the letter twice. Then he read the last line of the second paragraph again. It was delayed by order of your appointed magical guardian. He sat very still for a moment. Then he folded the letter, put it in his pocket, and started getting dressed. He was in the Leaky Cauldron by 8:15, having taken the night bus with a ferocity of purpose that made Stan Shunpike drop his clipboard. Tom the barman gave him a bowl of porridge without being asked and seemed to understand from the look on Harry's face that conversation was not on the menu. Harry ate quickly, watching the clock above the bar, and was standing in front of the great marble steps of Gringotts by 8:45. The goblins at the front entrance looked at him, looked at each other, and one of them, without a word, stepped aside and gestured down the main hall with a short, precise movement that said we've been expecting you, in a way that was somehow different from the polite version of that phrase. This was the version that meant something. He was shown not to one of the standard teller windows but through a side door he'd never noticed before, down a corridor lit by greenish lanterns that cast no shadows, and into a room that felt like the inside of a very old decision. The walls were stone, the table was a single slab of granite, and seated across from it was a goblin who looked at Harry with eyes the color of old copper coins and the expression of someone who had been waiting a very long time to have a particular conversation. Mr. Potter. The goblin gestured to the chair across from him. Sit. I am Gripclaw. I have managed House Potter's accounts since 1987, when I took over from my predecessor, Sharp Fong, who managed them from 1945. In that time, I have sent 31 standard correspondence notices to your appointed guardian requesting this audit be scheduled. In that time, I have received 31 letters of deferral, each citing a different reason, each signed by Albus Dumbledore. He placed a neat stack of letters on the table between them, all of them opened, all of them with the distinctive purple ink Dumbledore favored. I kept them. Harry looked at the stack. It was about 2 inches thick. You kept them, he said. Goblins keep everything, Mr. Potter. It is both our professional practice and our particular pleasure. Gripclaw folded his hands on the table. We will now conduct your audit. I would ask you to place your right hand flat on the ledger stone. The stone in question materialized on the table between them, or perhaps it had always been there and Harry simply hadn't seen it. It was smooth, dark, roughly the size of a large book, and when Harry's palm touched its surface it was warm in the way the letter had been warm. Alive, almost. State your full name. Harry James Potter. The stone pulsed once, gently, like a heartbeat. Bloodline acknowledged, Gripclaw said, and he was already writing, his quill moving with a precise speed that made Harry think of surgical instruments. We will now conduct the full lineage scan. This will take approximately 4 minutes. You may feel a pulling sensation. Harry felt it almost immediately, not painful, but insistent, like something deep in his chest was being gently turned. He breathed through it. The stone under his hand began to glow faintly, a warm amber color, and then lines of text began appearing on its surface, rising up through the dark stone like fish rising to a pond's surface. Names. Dates. Crests he didn't recognize. Numbers that seemed to have too many digits. He watched Gripclaw's expression as the goblin read. He'd thought goblins didn't have readable faces. He'd been wrong. Gripclaw's expression moved through several things in those 4 minutes: concentration, recognition, a tightening around the eyes that was unmistakably anger, and then a kind of settling, like a soldier who has confirmed what they suspected and is now simply deciding what to do about it. The stone stopped glowing. The warmth left Harry's hand. Gripclaw set down his quill. Mr. Potter, he said, and his voice had changed, still controlled, still precise, but carrying something underneath it now, something that a less composed being might have let show in their face. I need to ask you to remain calm while I explain what the audit has found. I recognize that is an unusual request. I make it because what I am about to tell you is significant, and I would prefer you to have the full picture before reacting. Harry looked at him steadily. Tell me. Gripclaw opened a leather folder on his table and removed a document that was several pages thick. You are aware that you are heir to House Potter? Yes. You are aware that you are heir to House Black, through your godfather, Sirius Black, who died last month and named you sole heir in a will registered with Gringotts in 1996. Something tightened in Harry's chest at Sirius's name, but he kept his face level. Yes. I know that. What you are not aware of, Gripclaw said, because you were prevented from being aware of it, is that you are the rightful heir to 40 additional houses. He set the document flat on the table and turned it to face Harry. These range from minor landed holdings, House Peveril, House Gryffindor, House Slytherin by conquest right, House Ravenclaw by maternal bloodline, to significant political seats. Houses with Wisengamot votes. Houses with vaults. Houses with magic tied to them, Mr. Potter, ancestral magic that flows to the head of those houses and nowhere else. He paused. Every single one of these inheritances has been sealed. The room was very quiet. Sealed, Harry said. Ritually sealed, which is a more serious matter than a simple legal block. A ritual seal on inheritance magic requires a blood magic agreement, a notarized intent document, and a witness signature from someone recognized by the magical world as a guardian or authority over the person being sealed. Gripclaw reached into the folder and removed another document, this one with a seal at the bottom that Harry recognized immediately. Purple ink. Ornate handwriting. A signature that curved through itself like a river through a very confident landscape. All 43 seals, I should clarify, 40 houses, but 3 of them carried dual seals for reasons I will explain, bear the same signature. The same date. July 31st, 1980. Harry stared at the signature. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. The day I was born, Harry said. The day you were born. Gripclaw's voice was flat now, with a flatness that communicated more than any amount of expression could have managed. The seals were placed before you were 24 hours old. Before you had drawn enough breath to cry properly. Before your mother had slept. He closed the folder with a precise click. I want to be clear about something, Mr. Potter, because Gringotts operates on clarity. These seals are not advisory. They are not symbolic. They are active, living magical bindings. They have been suppressing your access to ancestral magic, your political standing, your financial entitlements, and in several cases your access to knowledge, specifically, sealed memory vessels left in your vaults by your parents and your godfather, for 15 years and 4 months. The magic you have experienced, the power you have accessed during your time at Hogwarts, it represents, by our calculation, approximately 31% of what is rightfully yours. Harry heard a sound that it took him a moment to identify as coming from himself. A short, sharp exhale. 31%. 31, he said. 31. Gripclaw met his eyes without flinching. You have been fighting a war, Mr. Potter, a war in which Gringotts has observed you directly and by report, at 31% of your capacity, with no knowledge of your true political standing, no access to the resources your ancestors accumulated across 9 centuries, and no legal standing to challenge any of it, because you were sealed before you could ever know it needed challenging. Harry's hands were flat on the granite table. He noticed this, noted the way his fingers had spread, grounding himself physically because something in the center of his chest was doing something seismic that he wasn't ready to name yet. Can they be broken? He said. Gripclaw's expression shifted into something that, on a human face, might have been called satisfaction. That, he said, is precisely the right question, and the fact that you asked it before any other question tells me we are going to work together very well, Mr. Potter. He stood, moved to a cabinet on the wall, and returned with a small case made of dark wood, beautifully made, the Gringotts crest inlaid in the lid in brass. He set it on the table and opened it. Inside, on a cushion of dark velvet, sat 2 rings. The first was heavy gold, set with a stone that wasn't quite ruby and wasn't quite garnet, it was deeper than either, with a color that seemed to move slightly when the light touched it. Engraved on the band were the words Fortis et Fidelis, brave and faithful, and the Potter family crest, a stag rampant on a field of silver and green. The second ring was silver, old silver, the kind that has spent time near powerful magic and taken on a quality of depth that newer silver lacks, and set with a black stone in which something seemed to move when you looked at it too long. The black family crest, toujours per, though Harry suspected that motto was going to feel very different on his hand than it had on Sirius's mother's wall. Your lordship rings, Gripclaw said. Potter and black. The others will be accessible as each seal breaks, and the seals will break sequentially, as you formally claim each house. The process of claiming can be accelerated by your active engagement with each house's heritage, but the foundational 2, Potter and black, are yours today, without prerequisite, because the seals on them were the weakest. Dumbledore, it appears, did not think it necessary to seal those as heavily. Perhaps he assumed you would never investigate. Harry looked at the rings for a long moment. He picked up the Potter ring first. The moment his fingers closed around it, the room seemed to take a breath. The air changed, not dramatically, not with a flash of light or a crash of thunder, which was what Harry had half expected and which would have been deeply inconvenient in a granite room underground. It was subtler than that. It was the feeling of a door opening that had been closed so long you'd stopped noticing the wall. His chest expanded. Something settled into his bones that he hadn't known was missing, the way you don't know a sound has been bothering you until it stops. He slid the ring onto the middle finger of his right hand. It resized immediately, fitting him with a precision that felt like a handshake. He picked up the black ring. Thought of Sirius for a moment, not the Sirius who had fallen through the veil, but the Sirius who'd laughed in Grimmauld Place's kitchen, who'd given Harry a 2-fingered salute and called Dumbledore's overcaution a load of interfering nonsense. He thought Sirius would have opinions about today. Loud ones. He slid the ring onto his right hand beside the Potter ring and felt the second door open, and this one was larger. The magic that moved through him was real and physical and enormous. Not violent, not aggressive, more like standing in a river after spending your life in a puddle. He understood, in a way that was more sensation than thought, why the seals had been placed. Whatever Dumbledore had been afraid of, he'd been afraid of this particular quality of presence that Harry could already feel settling into him like a foundation being laid. He was going to have thoughts about that later. Many thoughts. But right now he looked at Gripclaw across the granite table, and something in his expression made the goblin incline his head. "There are more," Harry said. 40 houses. 40, yes. We can begin the claiming process today for the next 3, the others will require visits to the ancestral seats or specific ritual actions. Gripclaw was already pulling out more documents. "I would suggest we also discuss the financial dimension, the political dimension, and the matter of the sealed memory vessels." He looked up. "But I am also aware that you are 16, that you arrived here on your birthday having likely been told nothing, and that you have just received information that would give most adults something of a crisis. If you need a moment." "No," Harry said. He leaned forward in his chair. "Keep going. All of it. Give me all of it." Gripclaw looked at him for a moment with those copper coin eyes, and something moved in them that might, on a goblin, have been respect. "Very well," he said, and opened the next folder. They were in that room for 3.5 hours. By the time Gripclaw had finished, Harry had a clearer picture of his own history than he'd ever had before, and it was not a comfortable picture. The financial dimension alone was staggering. The 40 sealed houses had vaults, properties, investments, magical artifacts under preservation charms, library collections, and land holdings spread across Britain, France, Germany, and 3 territories in Eastern Europe that Harry didn't even know wizards had jurisdiction over. The cumulative total in the consolidated vault ledger had so many digits that Harry stopped being able to relate to it as money and started thinking of it as a number that existed in some abstract category above money. The political dimension was, in some ways, more immediately significant. The 40 houses represented, between them, 19 Wizengamot seats, voting seats, which meant that as their lord, Harry had the right to vote on every piece of legislation that passed through the wizarding governing body, or to assign proxies to vote in his name. The current balance of Wizengamot power in Britain was something Harry had vaguely understood as complicated and stacked against people who weren't old money. 19 extra votes, held by one person, would change that in a way that was going to make certain people extremely unhappy. He found he had no problem with that. The sealed memory vessels were the part that had made the room feel very small and close. Gripclaw had explained them carefully. His parents had left them on the day of the Fidelius charm, understanding that they might not survive, understanding that Harry might one day need to know things that couldn't be put in a letter. Sirius had added to them during his time as a free man, in the months before he died. They were physical objects, spheres about the size of a snitch, made of enchanted crystal, and they were sitting in Vault 687, which was a secondary Potter vault Harry had never known existed, because it had been sealed along with everything else. He could access those memories now. He wasn't sure he was ready to, not today, not right now, but the knowing that they were there and waiting for him was the thing that had finally made his eyes sting. He'd blinked it back. Gripclaw had looked down at his paperwork and given him the particular mercy of not commenting. Before he left, Gripclaw placed a small leather-bound notebook on the table, black, stamped with the Gringotts seal. "I have prepared a summary document," he said. "Your assets, your seats, the timeline of the seals, and a suggested order for the remaining claiming rituals. I would recommend you review it somewhere private." He met Harry's eyes. "I would also recommend that you consider your next steps very carefully, Mr. Potter. What was done to you was done by someone with considerable power and considerable influence. The path you take from this room will have consequences." Harry picked up the notebook. "Gripclaw," he said. "You kept 31 letters." "I did." "You noted the delay in the audit letter." "You flagged the signature on every seal." "Yes." "Why?" "You're a banker. This isn't your fight." Gripclaw was quiet for a moment. His copper eyes were steady and old and very direct. "Gringotts has managed the ancestral accounts of the great houses of Britain for 900 years, Mr. Potter. We have watched empires rise. We have watched them be stolen from their rightful holders by people who told themselves they had good reasons. We have kept ledgers that documented all of it. He stood and extended his hand across the granite table, not the way wizards shook hands, wrist to wrist, the old formal way. Gringotts does not take sides. But Gringotts keeps records. And occasionally, the records speak for themselves. Harry gripped his wrist. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in a way that went somewhere deeper than manners. He walked out of Gringotts at 12:37 into blinding July sunshine, and Diagon Alley was doing what it did on a summer Saturday, full of families, students, shop windows dressed up in back-to-school displays for the coming year, ice cream cones and owls and the smell of something from the Weasley twins' shop that might have been candy or might have been a mild explosive. Harry stood on the steps for a moment and let the sun hit him. He felt different. That was the only way he could name it, different in a way that wasn't metaphorical, it was physical, the way the magic had settled into him with the rings, the way the first two seals breaking had shifted something fundamental. He was aware, in a bone-deep way he hadn't been before, of the other 38 seals still in place, the way you're aware of a splinter even when you're not touching it. He was going to break all of them. Every single one. And then he was going to decide what to do about the man who'd put them there. He descended the steps and walked into the alley, and he was already thinking. Dumbledore had not sealed those houses out of malice. Harry was almost certain of that. It was the thing that made this complicated rather than simple, the thing that sat in his chest alongside the fury and kept it from being clean. Dumbledore had sealed them out of the same thing Dumbledore always operated from, a belief that he knew best, that the chessboard was his to manage, that Harry was a piece on it rather than a player at it. He'd looked at a newborn baby and decided that giving that baby access to 9 centuries of ancestral power and 19 Wizengamot seats before he could fight Voldemort would either make him a target or make him ungovernable. Maybe both. And so he'd sealed it. For the greater good, presumably. The phrase made Harry's teeth want to do something. He ducked into the leaky cauldron and took a corner table, ordered a butterbeer, and opened Gripclaw's notebook. The first page was a summary of the 40 houses in descending order of significance. He ran his finger down the list. Peveril. Gryffindor. Slytherin. Ravenclaw. Murden. Folly. Longbottom adjacent branch, secondary inheritance. Selwyn. Gaunt, by conquest right, given Voldemort is the last Gaunt and has formally renounced his humanity through repeated Horcrux creation, which under Goblin law constitutes abandonment of house rights, he stopped at that one. Stared at it. He was the heir to the Gaunt house. He was, effectively, by the convoluted logic of magical inheritance law, the heir to Voldemort's family line. That was going to be interesting. He turned the page and found the financial summary and stopped bothering to read the numbers in detail after the 4th entry. He turned to the section marked political seats and read that one very carefully. By the time he'd finished the butterbeer, he'd made 3 decisions. The first was that he was going to Hogwarts in September not as a student who was allowed to be there but as Lord Potterblack, heir to 40 houses, holder of 19 Wizengamot seats, and he was going to conduct himself accordingly. The second was that he was going to talk to Dumbledore. Not yell at him. Talk to him, the way you talk to someone who had done something serious, with evidence on the table and your eyes open. The third was that he needed Hermione and Ron, today, because this was too large to carry alone and he didn't want to carry it alone. He paid for the butterbeer, thought briefly that the notion of paying for butterbeer when he apparently had an incomprehensible amount of money in 43 vaults was somewhat absurd, and sent 2 Patronus messages, which was something he'd learned he could do this past year, the silver stag flickering into existence in the dim pub and heading off through walls without caring about architecture. Hermione. Ron. I'm at the leaky cauldron. Come now if you can. Something's happened. He closed the notebook, put it inside his jacket, and sat back in his chair. On his right hand, the 2 rings caught the light from the pub window. The Potter's stone pulsed once, warm and steady, like something waking up. He let it. Ron arrived first, because Ron lived closer, tumbling through the leaky cauldron's door with his hair doing something impressive and a piece of toast still in his hand. He'd clearly come the moment the Patronus arrived without bothering to finish breakfast. He took one look at Harry across the pub, looked at his hand, and crossed the room in 5 strides. "What are those?" He dropped into the chair across from Harry, eyes on the rings. "Lordship rings." Ron stared. "You went to Gringotts." "I was summoned." 16th birthday audit. Ron stopped. Started again. "Harry. Those are lordship rings. As in, Lord Potter. As in, actual, and Lord Black." Harry held up his hand. "Sirius left everything to me." Apparently that also means the lordship, not just the house and the money. Ron was quiet for a moment in the way that Ron was quiet when he was actually thinking hard about something rather than just being quiet. "How much did they find?" Harry looked at him. 40 houses. The toast fell out of Ron's hand. 40, Harry repeated. 40 houses that should have been mine from birth. All sealed. He watched Ron's face cycle through approximately 7 emotions in 4 seconds. "By Dumbledore." Ron said something that would have made Molly Weasley put him in a headlock, and then he said it again for emphasis, and Harry felt something in his chest unclench slightly because Ron's uncomplicated fury was, in this moment, exactly what he needed. "He sealed your..." Ron shook his head. "On what, how, when?" "The day I was born." "The day..." Ron picked up the toast, put it down again, pointed at Harry. "Okay. Right. We're fixing this. We're already starting to." "Good. What do we need?" This, Harry thought, was why Ron was his best friend. Not because Ron was uncomplicated, he wasn't, not really, there was a great deal of Ron Weasley that ran very deep, but because when something was wrong, Ron's first question was always "what do we do?" rather than "are you sure?" or "maybe there's a reason." The thinking came later with Ron. The standing beside you came first. "I need to talk to Hermione," Harry said. "And then I need to make some decisions." "You need to talk to Dumbledore," Ron said, with the tone of someone identifying a dragon in the room. "Yes. Are you going to yell at him?" Harry thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "I'm going to be worse than that." Before Ron could respond, the door opened and Hermione came through it, and she had clearly run at least part of the way here because there was a flush in her face and her hair was even more impressive than usual, and she was already looking between them with an expression that said she'd been running several scenarios since the Patronus arrived and none of them had apparently prepared her for whatever she saw in Harry's face. She sat down. Looked at his hand. Looked at him. "Tell me everything," she said. So he told them. All of it, Gripclaw, the ledger stone, the 31 letters, the 40 houses, the numbers, the Wisengamot seats, the memory vessels, the signature on every seal. He talked for 20 minutes and neither of them interrupted, which was notable for both of them, because Ron was usually incapable of not interrupting and Hermione was usually incapable of not asking clarifying questions. They sat and they listened and he watched them absorb it. When he finished, the 3 of them sat in silence for a moment. Hermione had tears in her eyes, which she was not shedding, because Hermione Granger controlled herself with the iron grip of someone who'd learned very early that crying was often less useful than thinking. But they were there. "The memory vessels," she said. "From your parents. And Sirius." She pressed her lips together hard. Nodded. "You have to see those." "I know. Soon. Harry." She looked at him with the particular focus she reserved for things that mattered. "Dumbledore will have a reason. He always has a reason. And the reason will be coherent and it will probably make a certain kind of sense and," she stopped. Started again. "And it will still be wrong. What was done to you was wrong." He looked at her steadily. "I know." "Good," she said. "I just wanted to be sure you knew that I knew that." She straightened in her chair, and he could see her sorting through it, filing it into the part of her brain that processed large and complicated problems. 19 Wiesengemot seats. Harry, that is, do you understand what that means, politically? I have some ideas. The current minister barely passed the last 3 pieces of legislation because the Wiesengemot was within 2 or 3 votes. If you claim those seats, or even assign proxies, I know. And House Slytherin. You're claiming House Slytherin, by conquest right. There are going to be people who try to use that to, let them try, Harry said, and there was something in his voice that made both Ron and Hermione look at him for a moment, something they hadn't quite heard there before, or perhaps hadn't heard quite so settled. Let them try, he said again, more quietly. I'm not hiding from any of it. Ron leaned forward, both elbows on the table, pointing at the rings. So what's next? What's the actual next step? Harry pulled out Gripclaw's notebook, opened it to the page he'd marked, and put it flat on the table between them. The next 3 houses I can claim this week, if I complete the rituals. There's a list. Peveril first. I already have the Deathly Hallows connection, apparently that counts as partial recognition, so the Peveril claim is almost automatic. He tapped the list. After that, I need to visit the ancestral seats for most of them, which means locations across Britain and, he paused. And France, apparently. Ron looked at the list, processing. Longbottom adjacent branch, he read. Does that mean Neville's house wasn't sealed? But the secondary inheritance, a branch of his family line that connects to my maternal ancestry through the Perkins line, was. He might have questions when this becomes public. Harry looked at Ron. And it will become public. I can't claim 19 Wiesengemot seats quietly. Dumbledore will find out, Hermione said. That's the idea, Harry said. She looked at him for a long moment. You're going to let him come to you. I'm going to give him the chance to explain himself before I decide what comes next. He met her eyes. But I'm not waiting long. And I'm not, he paused, choosing the word carefully. I'm not going to let him manage this. I'm not going to let him frame it and soften it and make it into another one of his long-term plans. What he did is what it is. I'm going to look at it clearly and decide what to do based on that. Hermione held his gaze for a moment and then nodded once, sharp and decisive, and that nod meant something. It meant she was with him. Right, said Ron, picking the toast up again and finally eating it. So. France, then. Anyone know a good French phrasebook? Harry laughed, a real one, short and surprised, and it cracked something open in the atmosphere of the table, the way only Ron could crack things open, with perfect timing and not a trace of self-consciousness. Hermione made a sound that was trying not to be a laugh and failing. Harry shook his head. First, Harry said, I need to go back to Gringotts. I need to claim Peveril. And I need to retrieve the memory vessels. He looked at both of them. And I think you should be there. Neither of them hesitated. Obviously, said Hermione. Obviously, said Ron, finishing the toast. They stood up from the table, the 3 of them, and Harry glanced at his hand one more time, the 2 rings, gold and silver, warm in the afternoon light coming through the pub window. Somewhere below Gringotts, in a vault he'd never known existed, his parents had left him something they'd hoped he'd never need. Sirius had left him something too. A voice, captured in crystal, waiting. He was 16 years old today, and the world had just become both larger and more complicated than it had been at breakfast, and he had a war still to fight and a mentor to confront and 40 houses to reclaim and the better part of a century of stolen inheritance to untangle. He walked out of the leaky cauldron into the sunshine between his 2 best friends. The Potter ring pulsed again. The black ring answered it. He didn't look back. Chapter 2, What the Portraits Know. The memory vessels were smaller than Harry had imagined. He'd pictured something significant looking, heavy spheres of dark glass, maybe, or something that glowed, something that announced itself as important the way important things in the wizarding world usually did. What Gripclaw placed on the granite table were 3 objects that could have passed for decorative paperweights, crystal balls no bigger than a snitch, each one clouded slightly from the inside, like breath on cold glass. The first had a faint golden quality to the cloud. The second was silver. The third, Sirius's, was the deep blue of sky just before it goes properly dark. The process is simple, Gripclaw said, watching Harry with the carefully neutral expression he seemed to deploy when he thought someone might need a moment and was being tactful about it. You place your palm over the vessel, speak your name and your claim to the memories within, and the crystal will dissolve into your palm. The memories will integrate. It is not painful, though people report it as overwhelming. How overwhelming? Ron asked from his chair against the wall, where he and Hermione had positioned themselves with the instinctive understanding that this was Harry's moment but that being present for it mattered. Depends on what was left, Gripclaw said. These were deposited under considerable emotional stress. The memories will carry that with them. Hermione had her hands folded in her lap with a tension that was doing interesting things to her knuckles. Harry, you don't have to do all 3 today. You could, I'm doing all 3 today, Harry said. He picked up the golden one first. His mother's. He didn't know how he knew it was hers before Gripclaw confirmed it, but he knew, there was something about the quality of the light inside it, warm and precise at the same time, that felt like the few photographs he had of Lily Potter, something that was simultaneously gentle and absolutely not to be argued with. He closed his hand around it, felt it warm against his palm immediately, and said, Harry James Potter. I claim these memories. They were left for me. The crystal didn't dissolve so much as it decided to stop being crystal. The warmth spread up his arm, into his chest, and then it hit him, not a vision exactly, more like being inside someone else's certainty. His mother's voice, not speaking words he could make out linearly but communicating in the way that memories sometimes did, in pure intent, I know what's been done. I know what will be done. I left you what I could. The Peveril line is older than you know and so is your blood. Don't let anyone tell you what you're worth. Don't let anyone make you small for their convenience. You are a Potter. You are a prince. You are more than I had time to tell you. And then, overlaid on this, information, actual information, dense and specific, about the houses and the lineages, about ritual magic his mother had researched in the months before she died because she'd known something was wrong with the way Dumbledore talked about Harry's future, about a clause in old goblin law that could accelerate the unclaiming process if Harry ever found out and chose to invoke it. His mother, apparently, had been doing her research. The warmth faded. Harry was aware that the room was very quiet. He set his hand down on the table. Breathed once. Okay, he said. He picked up the silver one. His father's. James Potter communicated differently than Lily. Where Lily had been information wrapped in love, James was love communicated through action. Harry felt it as a rush of images rather than words, his father flying, his father laughing, his father sitting across from Dumbledore with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and the set of that jaw was something Harry recognized with a jolt because he'd seen it in mirrors. His father, it turned out, had not been entirely comfortable with the arrangements either. There had been arguments. His father had pushed back. And then Voldemort had come and there had been other things to focus on, and the arguments had been tabled, and, I'm sorry, James said, in the particular language of deposited memory, I should have pushed harder. You're going to be extraordinary. Don't be careful. Be you. That one was shorter. More like his father, Harry suspected, direct, no fuss, get to the point and get on with it. He sat with it for a moment and then reached for the blue one. Sirius's memories were chaotic and funny and heartbreaking all at once, which was exactly what Harry would have expected. They came in at an angle, the way Sirius always had, not the front door, always the window, always with a grin. Harry got impressions of Azkaban. He pushed past those, feeling Sirius push back in the memory, don't dwell, pup, there's nothing useful there, of Grimmauld Place and the Order meetings and Sirius sitting alone after everyone had gone home doing what he'd clearly done a lot of in those months, research. He'd been researching too. He'd known about the seals. He'd been trying to find a way to challenge them from outside Gringotts, through historical precedent and Wisengamot procedure, and he'd gotten most of the way there before the Department of Mysteries. The memory didn't approach that moment. It stepped around it, and Harry understood, Sirius had deposited this before the Department of Mysteries. He'd left it when he'd had some private premonition, some dog's instinct that his time was running uncertain. If you're hearing this, the memory said, in something that was as close to Sirius's actual voice as anything Harry had ever experienced, warm and reckless and fond, then I didn't make it, and I'm sorry for that too, because I really intended to. But here's what I found. Here's the legal route. Here's who to trust in the Wisengamot, old Marchetti. She's 90 and she's terrifying and she owes your grandfather a debt she's never paid. Here's what I know about what he did and why. And here's something your mother told me the night before the Fidelius charm, which I think you need to know. The something Lily had told Sirius was this, that she had told Dumbledore, directly, that sealing Harry's inheritance was a mistake. That she had argued it. That Dumbledore had listened with that particular quality of listening he had, where you felt heard and then nothing changed. And she had said to Sirius, the night before Voldemort came, if something happens to us, and he does it anyway, make sure Harry knows. Make sure he knows I fought for him. The blue crystal finished dissolving. Harry was perfectly still for what he estimated to be about 30 seconds. Nobody said anything. The green lanterns cast their unchanging light and the granite room held its particular quality of old silence. Then he stood up from the chair, straightened his jacket, and looked at Gripclaw. The Peveril claim, he said. Let's do that now. The Peveril claiming took 11 minutes and left a third ring on Harry's right hand, old bone-pale gold with a triangle and circle and line engraved on the stone in lines so fine they were almost invisible. The moment it settled onto his finger, something shifted again, and this time it was different from the Potter and black rings. This one felt like depth rather than breadth, like standing at the top of something very tall and looking down and not feeling afraid of the distance. Old magic, his mother had said in her memory. Older than you know. He believed it. On the way out of Gringotts, Gripclaw stopped them at the entrance corridor with one additional item, a small sealed envelope. Formal notice, he said, handing it to Harry. As of today, Gringotts has filed your lordship claims for Potter, Black, and Peveril with the Wisengamot registry. This is standard procedure. The registry notification will reach the relevant parties, he paused with precise timing. Within 48 hours. Harry looked at the envelope. 48 hours. Standard procedure, Gripclaw said, with an expression that had absolutely nothing in it. Harry pocketed the envelope. Thank you, Gripclaw. Gringotts keeps records, Gripclaw said, which Harry was beginning to understand was the goblin equivalent of you're welcome and I'm rooting for you and go get them all at once. They came out of the bank into the afternoon sun, which had gotten warmer while they were underground, and Hermione turned immediately to Harry with the expression she wore when she had been sitting on several things for an extended period and was now going to say them. The clause your mother found, she said. In goblin law. What exactly? It accelerates the claiming process. If I can get Gringotts to formally certify that the seals were placed without the sealed party's knowledge or consent, which they can, because I was a day old, I can complete the remaining 37 claims through a single consolidated ritual rather than 40 individual ones. He looked at her. It would still take time to arrange. But it compresses weeks into potentially days. Hermione's eyes went to a specific kind of bright that they went to when a large problem had a large solution. Can Gringotts certify that without, Gripclaw is already preparing the documentation, Harry said. He started when I told him about the memory vessels. I think he'd been waiting for a reason to prepare it for some time. Ron had been quiet since the vault room, which was unusual enough that Harry had clocked it. He looked at him now. Ron. I'm thinking, Ron said. About what? About the fact that you've got your mum's voice in your head now. He said it simply, without drama, looking at Harry with the particular directness that was Ron's version of emotional precision. "And your dad's? And Sirius?" He paused. "Are you okay?" The question landed exactly where it was aimed. Harry considered giving the automatic answer, the "I'm fine, let's focus on the next step" answer, and decided against it because it was Ron asking and Ron would see through it immediately anyway. "Not entirely," he said honestly. "But I will be. And right now I've got things I need to do while I'm still running on." He searched for the word. "Momentum." Ron nodded, accepting this with the grace of someone who understood the tactical value of keeping moving. "Where are we going?" "Hogwarts," Harry said. Hermione looked at him sharply. "It's July. Dumbledore might not be, he's there." Harry said it with a certainty he couldn't entirely explain except that it felt true. "He's always there. And in 48 hours the Wizengamot registry notification reaches him officially, so if I'm going to talk to him before this becomes a formal matter of public record, it needs to be now." There was a beat. "Right," said Hermione. "I'll arrange transportation." The castle in summer was a different animal than the castle during term. It was somehow both larger and quieter. The corridors had an echo that got swallowed during the year by the press of 800 students, and in their absence, Hogwarts made itself felt as what it actually was, a very old, very large, very opinionated building that had been watching history move through it for 1,000 years and had opinions about all of it. The enchanted staircases moved politely out of their way as they walked. Harry noticed this and filed it under possibly significant, possibly just the castle. The headmaster's office door was closed but not warded, which meant Dumbledore was either inside or had recently left and expected to return shortly. Harry knocked once, sharply, and the gargoyle stepped aside without requiring a password, which was new. He was fairly sure gargoyles recognized authority in some instinctive way, and the rings on his hand were apparently emitting something the gargoyle found convincing. They climbed the spiral staircase. Harry pushed the door open. Dumbledore was behind his desk, reading something, and he looked up with an expression that settled into something complicated so quickly that most people probably would have missed the thing it was settling from, which was something startled and careful. But Harry was watching for it and he caught it, the brief flash of a man who had been waiting for this and still been caught slightly off guard by the actual arrival of it. "Harry," Dumbledore said, warm and welcoming, rising from his chair. "This is a surprise." Ah. His eyes had gone to Harry's right hand. The 3 rings. The warmth in his expression didn't change but something behind it did, very slightly, in the way that very controlled people adjust themselves. "I see you've had a productive birthday." "Sit down, Professor," Harry said. There was a pause. Nobody spoke to Albus Dumbledore that way in his own office, or at least, nobody had in a very long time. The portraits on the walls stirred. Harry was peripherally aware of Phineas Nigellus Black's portrait going very still and attentive in a way that suggested he was suddenly finding the room extremely interesting. Dumbledore sat down. His expression was, Harry had to give him this, genuinely composed. Not defensive. Not angry. Something more like a man preparing to be accountable, which told Harry that Dumbledore had known this conversation was coming eventually and had been thinking about how to have it. Harry put Gripclaw's notebook on the desk and opened it to the page with the sealed documentation. He turned it to face Dumbledore and placed his finger on the bottom of the page, on the signature. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the old man across the desk. Dumbledore looked at the document for a long moment. He took off his half-moon glasses, polished them with the sleeve of his robe, a habit, Harry knew, that meant he was gathering himself, and put them back on. "How many?" he asked quietly. 40 houses. 3 claimed so far. Harry's voice was level. 42 seals, actually, 3 of the houses had dual seals. "I have a full list." Dumbledore closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were, and this was the thing Harry had been dreading slightly, because it would have been easier if they weren't, genuinely full of something. Not regret exactly. Something more complicated. Something that wanted to be regret but was still tangled up with the conviction that had made him do it in the first place. You want to know why, Dumbledore said. I want to hear your reason, Harry said. I already know the why. I want to hear you say it. The old man was quiet for a moment. The office hummed with the gentle sounds of its instruments, the whirring and clicking of things measuring invisible quantities. Fawkes, on his perch in the corner, was watching Harry with orange eyes that were warm and non-judgmental and somehow deeply understanding of the situation. When you were born, Dumbledore began, and his voice had changed, not performing now, not the warm theatrical register he used for speeches or the gentle one he used for difficult conversations. This was quieter and older, the voice of someone talking about something they'd lived with for a long time. I knew what Voldemort was. I knew the prophecy. I knew what was coming for you, and I knew, he stopped. I knew that a child who grew up knowing he was lord of 40 houses, heir to 19 Wysengamaut seats, with access to 9 centuries of ancestral power, would grow up a target. Not just Voldemort's target. Everyone's. Old alliances and old enemies and political factions who would see in you either a weapon or a threat and would come for you before you were old enough to understand why. So you made me small, Harry said. For my protection. I made you survivable, Dumbledore said, and the distinction mattered to him. Harry could see that, mattered in the way that careful choices matter to the people who made them and lived with them. I gave you a childhood in which the only person who wanted you were people who wanted the chosen one, not the lord of 40 houses. I thought, he stopped again. Looked at his hands on the desk. I thought that if you survived to adulthood with Voldemort defeated, the seals could be broken then. I thought the inheritance could be restored when it was safe. You thought you'd manage the timing, Harry said. Yes. You thought you'd decide when I was ready. Yes. Without telling me. Dumbledore was quiet. With 31 letters from Gringotts asking you to schedule my audit, Harry said. Letters you deferred. Every year. A different reason every time. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The facts were doing the work. You knew Gringotts was pushing for the audit. You knew that if I walked into that building they'd find what you'd done. So you kept me away from it. He paused. How exactly did you plan to break the seals? When were you going to tell me? When Voldemort was dead? When I was 30? When you decided the moment was right? Dumbledore said nothing for long enough that the silence answered the question. You didn't have a plan for that part, Harry said. I had, Dumbledore started, and then, with something that looked like genuine honesty costing him something, he stopped. I had intentions. I had not fully arranged the mechanism by which, you had intentions, Harry said, nodding slowly, but no concrete plan to actually give it back. He sat back in his chair. Because once you sealed it, the idea of unsealing it meant explaining why you'd done it. And explaining it meant this conversation. And somewhere in the last 15 years, this conversation became a thing you kept not having. Hermione made a small sound from her chair by the wall. Ron had gone very still. Dumbledore looked at Harry across the desk, this old, extraordinary, genuinely good man who had made a genuinely terrible decision and spent 15 years not quite confronting it, and he said, You're right. On every count. I was wrong. He said it plainly, without decoration or qualification. I was wrong, Harry. And this was the complicated part, the part Harry had known would be complicated. Because Dumbledore meant it. It wasn't strategy or deflection. The old man looked, for just a moment, his age, and his age was catastrophic. Harry looked at him for a long moment. I believe you, he said. I believe you were wrong with the best possible intentions, and I believe you regret it. He leaned forward. And none of that changes what I'm doing. I'm going to claim all 40 houses. I'm going to take my Wysengamaut seats. I'm going to access everything you sealed. And I'm going to fight Voldemort with all of it, not 31% of what's mine, all of it. And I'm going to do it my way. Dumbledore held his gaze. I would not try to stop you. I know, Harry said. Because you can't. He said it without heat, as simple fact. The 3 rings on his hand caught the afternoon light from the office's tall windows. In the corner, Fawkes let out a note, a single, clear, rising tone that wasn't quite a song and wasn't quite speech but seemed to land somewhere between them like a verdict nobody had asked for and everyone had needed. Dumbledore, after a moment, nodded. I have one question, Harry said. 1. Ask it. Did my parents know? When you sealed it, did they consent? The old man's expression shifted through several things, and Harry watched them all carefully. Your mother objected, Dumbledore said. Strongly. Your father was, more ambivalent, but ultimately deferred to Lily's position, which was opposition. He held Harry's gaze. I proceeded regardless, because I believed I was right, and because as your appointed guardian I had the legal authority to do so. I proceeded over your mother's explicit objection. The room was absolutely still. Thank you, Harry said. For telling me that honestly. He stood up. Hermione and Ron stood with him. Harry, Dumbledore said, and Harry paused. I would like, if you're willing, to help. Not to manage or to direct. I am aware that I have permanently lost any standing to do either. But I know things about the ancestral magic in those houses. I know things about the ritual history of several of the seals that might help accelerate your claiming process. I would like to offer that knowledge, if you'll take it. Harry looked at him for a moment. I'll think about it, he said. Which was not yes and was not no, and Dumbledore, who was still the smartest person Harry had ever met regardless of everything, understood exactly what it meant. They were halfway to the door when one of the portraits spoke. Well, said Phineas Nigellus Black, in a voice thick with something that wanted to be contempt but was fighting quite hard against being impressed, Lord Potter Black. I must say. He was looking at Harry with an expression that was difficult to read, which was the portrait's standard setting, but underneath it was something more like recognition. Your grandfather would have approved of that conversation. Harry paused and looked at the portrait. Which grandfather? Both of them, Phineas said, and turned to study the frame's corner with great intensity. Harry almost smiled. He turned and walked out. The corridor outside the headmaster's office was quiet, and the 3 of them stood in it for a moment while the spiral staircase descended behind them with a soft grinding of old stone. Hermione was the first to speak. He didn't make excuses. No, Harry agreed. He just told you. Clearly. Your mother objected and he did it anyway. She was processing as she spoke, her voice doing the thing it did when her brain was moving faster than her emotions could keep up with. I don't, she pressed her lips together. He's always been, I know, Harry said. It doesn't make him a villain, she said, and it cost her something to say it, he could tell, not because she wanted Dumbledore to be a villain but because naming complexity was sometimes harder than choosing a side. It makes him someone who was wrong in a very serious way and who knew it and didn't stop. That's its own kind of thing, Ron said quietly. Yes, said Hermione. It is. They walked. The castle carried them along its corridors with the particular summer quiet, sunlight doing unusual things through windows at this angle of day, dust motes in the shafts of it moving slowly like things that had nowhere to be. What are you actually going to do with 19 Wizengamot seats? Ron asked, after a while. He wasn't being flippant, there was genuine curiosity in it, the practical curiosity of someone who'd grown up in a family that understood political systems the way Harry understood Quidditch. Sit in them, Harry said. Vote in them. And start working out which of the existing legislation needs undoing before we can actually fix the things Voldemort's been breaking. He paused on a staircase landing. But first I need the rest of the houses. The consolidated ritual Gripclaw mentioned, I need to get that arranged. There's something else, Hermione said. She'd been holding it since the office, he could tell, something she'd worked out while he was talking to Dumbledore. The Wizengamot notification goes out in 48 hours. Right now, it's Potter, Black, and Peveril. When people see all three, they'll know Gringotts ran the audit, Harry said. And they'll know the audit found sealed houses, Hermione continued. And they'll start asking who sealed them. And the answer to that is going to become public before you've claimed everything. Harry thought about this. Good, he said. She blinked. Good. Let them ask. Let them know. Dumbledore's power in this situation has always been that everyone assumes he does things for good reasons and doesn't look too closely at what those things are. When the sealed houses become public record, he looked at her. People start looking. I want them looking. Hermione was quiet for a moment, thinking it through. Yes. Yes, that actually makes sense. The faster the political reality of this becomes known, the harder it is for anyone to try to quietly manage the fallout. She paused. You've been thinking about this a lot for someone who found out this morning. I've been thinking about it since Gripclaw said 31%, Harry said. Something clicked. Ron glanced at him sideways. Something clicked, he repeated. Mate, you walked in there and took apart one of the most powerful wizards alive in a calm voice without raising your wand or your voice, and something clicked. Didn't need my wand, Harry said. Right, said Ron, with the particular tone of someone recalibrating. Right. Okay. Something clicked. They came out onto a corridor that faced west, and the afternoon light came through the windows in broad warm slabs and turned the stone walls briefly gold. Harry stopped and looked out across the grounds, the lake in the distance, the Quidditch pitch, the dark fringe of the Forbidden Forest. He'd been looking at this view for 5 years and it had always felt like home in the way that complicated things feel like home, not uncomplicated, not entirely comfortable, but unmistakably his. He turned it over in his mind, the conversation in the office, Dumbledore's face, the memory vessels, his mother's voice in his chest saying don't let anyone make you small for their convenience. He thought about the word survivable, the way Dumbledore had said it like it was a gift he'd given, and he thought about what it meant that his version of survivable had been 31% of his actual capacity, fighting a war with both hands half-tied, and had still been enough to get this far. He didn't feel smug about that. He felt something more complicated, something that was partly proud and partly sad about the wasted years and partly furious in a cold, clarifying way at the waste of it. Neville, he said suddenly. Ron and Hermione both looked at him. The audit noted a Longbottom adjacent branch. Secondary inheritance. Neville's not going to be affected directly, but he should know about it. Harry turned from the window. He's at his grand's for the summer. I can write to him, Hermione said immediately. Or we could visit. She hesitated. Harry, he's going to have questions. About all of this. About Dumbledore. Everyone's going to have questions about Dumbledore, Harry said. That's fine. The answers are what they are. He began walking again, and they fell into step on either side of him. I want Neville at Gringotts when I do the consolidated claiming ritual, if Gripclaw can arrange it. He should see it. He should be part of it. Why? Ron asked. Because Neville Longbottom is going to be an important person in Wizarding Britain in about 6 months, Harry said, with a certainty that came from the same place as the certainty about Dumbledore being in the castle, the place where the ancestral magic had settled into his bones and given him a kind of clarity he was still learning to trust. And it's going to help him to know he didn't do it alone. Ron looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating again, getting used to a new set of information about a person he thought he knew. He did this without making it weird, which was one of Ron's best qualities. Right, he said simply. We'll get Neville. They were passing the portrait of the fat lady's corridor. She was absent from her frame, visiting some cousin on the 3rd floor apparently, when Harry paused. One more thing, he said. What? He looked at Hermione specifically. When we get back to London, I want to talk to you about something serious left in the memory vessel. A legal route he'd started working out, for challenging the seals through Wisengamot historical precedent, in addition to what Gringotts is doing. He paused. I think it's solid. But I need someone who's better at legal research than I am to help me develop it. Hermione looked at him with an expression that was approximately the equivalent of pointing a compass at magnetic north. Completely, helplessly aligned. Obviously, she said. Obviously, said Ron. They started moving again, the three of them, down the corridor and toward the great staircase and out into the summer. Behind them, in the headmaster's office, Albus Dumbledore sat for a long time in his chair looking at nothing in particular. Around him the instruments whirred. Fawkes watched him from his perch with those warm orange eyes. The portraits were unusually silent, even Phineas Nigellus had retreated into his frame's painted shadow and wasn't commenting, which was perhaps the most significant statement of all. Dumbledore reached into his desk drawer and removed a piece of parchment. He looked at it for a moment, a draft of something he'd written and never sent, some years ago, in one of the many late nights when he'd sat with what he'd done and tried to decide whether to undo it. He hadn't sent it. He'd told himself the timing wasn't right. He'd told himself Harry wasn't ready. He hadn't asked Harry what Harry thought. He folded the parchment once, precisely, and placed it back in the drawer. Then he picked up a fresh sheet and began writing. Not to Harry, that conversation was done and the next one would be on Harry's terms, as it should be. He wrote to Gripclaw instead, formally, in the language that Gringotts preferred, direct, specific, without ceremony. He offered everything he knew about the ritual history of the 42 seals. The magic he'd used. The specific counter-ritual that would make the consolidated claiming possible in a single session rather than requiring the ancestral seat visits. He wrote for 40 minutes. He sealed the letter with his own seal, not the Hogwarts crest, just his initials, and gave it to a school owl, and then he sat and looked out his window at the summer evening settling over the grounds. He had done many things in his long life that he'd had to live with afterward. Some of them he'd made peace with. Some of them he hadn't. This one, he suspected, was going to sit with him in the particular way that the things involving children sat with him, not comfortable, not resolved, but honest at least now. Out in the open where it could actually be dealt with. It was not enough. He knew it wasn't enough. But it was something. It was the something he could do now. He reached for his wand, turned it once between his fingers in the old habit, and then set it on the desk and didn't pick it up again. Harry was on the night bus back to London when he felt it, the fourth seal breaking. He hadn't done anything to cause it. No ritual, no active claiming, nothing. He was sitting in the lurching, chaotic upper deck of the bus with Ron asleep against the window and Hermione reading next to him, and it happened without warning, a pulling sensation in his right hand and then a warmth spreading through his whole arm, and the sense of a door opening somewhere old and enormous, and knowledge settling into him the way the previous three had settled but quieter, more like a library than a flood. House Gryffindor. Of course. He'd sat in Gryffindor's hall for 5 years, been sorted there, defended it, won points for it, bled for it in various metaphorical and occasionally literal ways. Apparently the ancestral magic had decided that constituted a claim and wasn't waiting for a formal ritual. No ring appeared. Gripclaw had mentioned that some of the claiming would be passive, that the ancestral magic would make its own assessments, but he felt the shift in himself, the deepening of something, and he thought about the sword of Gryffindor pulling itself into his hand in a freezing pool of water in the forest of Dean, how natural it had felt, how inevitable. He'd been Gryffindor's heir his whole life. The magic had apparently just been waiting for him to know it too. Hermione looked up from her book. She'd noticed, she always noticed, the slight change in his expression. What happened? Gryffindor, he said. It just, decided. She stared at him. Without a ritual. Apparently I've been living in his hall for 5 years. He met her eyes. Apparently that counts. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, with the careful tone of someone trying not to make something too large, Harry. You are going to be one of the most powerful wizards alive. I know, he said. How do you feel about that? He thought about it honestly. Outside the bus window, London slid past in the summer dark, the Muggle city doing its ordinary nighttime things, lit up and busy and completely unaware. He thought about 31%. He thought about his mother's voice. He thought about Dumbledore saying survivable like it was a kindness. Like it was always true, he said. And someone just handed me the evidence. Hermione held his gaze for a moment, this girl who had been the most brilliant person in every room she'd ever entered and who had never once made Harry feel like less for knowing it, and she nodded once. Turned back to her book. Ron was still asleep. Snoring, lightly. His hand had at some point come to rest on his wand in the unconscious habit of someone who'd spent the last 2 years understanding that sleep was safer with your wand closed. Harry leaned back in his seat. 4 houses. 4 doors open. 36 left. He was going to enjoy the rest of them. Chapter 3, The Courts of Stone and Blood. The Wizengamot chamber smelled like old certainty. Harry noticed it the moment he walked through the antechamber doors, not unpleasant, exactly, more like the smell of a room that had been making important decisions for so long that the importance had soaked into the stone itself. Cedar and candle smoke and something mineral underneath, like the rock of the building, had its own opinion about everything that happened inside it. The chamber was circular, tiered, the seats rising in concentric rings around a central floor, and in the morning light coming through high narrow windows it looked exactly like what it was, a room designed to remind everyone in it that they were part of something older than themselves. Which was, Harry thought, precisely the problem. It was the 3rd of August, 3 days after his birthday, 2 days after the Wizengamot registry notification had gone out, and he was here because he'd received, within 12 hours of each other, 17 different pieces of formal correspondence requesting his presence at an emergency session. Some of them were polite. Some of them were demanding. One of them, from a Lord Cassius Malfoy, had been so elaborately courteous that it functioned as a threat. He'd replied to all of them with the same 3 sentences: I will attend the emergency session on August 3rd. I hold 19 seats and will be exercising my voting rights. I look forward to meeting my colleagues. Hermione had helped him draft it. Ron had read it over his shoulder and said it was going to make certain people absolutely furious, which they'd agreed was fine. Gripclaw had sent a goblin escort, 4 of them, which Harry suspected was more statement than necessity, the goblin equivalent of a formal announcement, and they walked ahead and behind him through the Ministry of Magic's atrium with a precision that parted the morning crowd like a boat through water. Harry walked through the center of it in his best robes, dark green, which Hermione had selected with a look that dared him to argue, with the Potter, black, and Peveril rings on his right hand and the Gryffindor claim sitting warm and settled in his bones, and he was aware of every eye that followed him. He was also aware of Neville Longbottom walking beside him, which was the part of this morning that had genuinely surprised him. Neville had arrived at Grimmauld Place the previous evening, which Harry had officially taken possession of as Lord Black, to the great discomfort of Creature, who had gotten one look at the rings and performed a rapid reassessment of his entire worldview, within 3 hours of receiving Hermione's letter. He'd come in the front door with his wand out of habit and a look on his face that said the letter had given him a great deal to think about during the journey and he'd done all of it. The Longbottom secondary inheritance, he'd said, before Harry could even get him a cup of tea. The branch through the Perkins line. Is it significant? It means, Harry had said, that when I complete the consolidated claiming, a dormant secondary vault becomes active under your family's stewardship. It's not a huge amount, the branch was minor, but it also means your family had a connection to mine that nobody told either of us about. And it means, he'd added, watching Neville's face, that you've got standing to attend the Wizengamot session tomorrow, if you want it. As a lord in good standing. Your own family seat. Neville had been quiet for a moment, in the particular way he developed over the last year, not the nervous quiet of a boy who didn't know what to say, but the thoughtful quiet of a person who understood the weight of things. Augusta's going to have thoughts about that, he'd said, referring to his grandmother. Probably very loud ones, Harry had agreed. She'll be proud, actually. Neville had almost smiled. She's been waiting for me to do something worthy of the name for years. He'd looked at Harry. I'm coming. Obviously. So here he was, walking through the ministry at Harry's shoulder with his chin up and his jaw set and the long-bottom crest on his robes. He looked, Harry thought, like someone who had finally figured out which room he was supposed to be in and wasn't planning to leave. The antechamber outside the Wizengamot was full when they arrived, and full in the way of rooms that have too many agendas competing for the same oxygen. Harry clocked it immediately, the clusters of robes and whispered conversations that stopped when the door opened, the quick assessments that people tried to make look casual, the pointed way certain groups moved slightly away from other certain groups. Political weather. Ron's mum had been right about one thing she'd said at breakfast once: the Wizengamot was just school with more expensive robes and less honest. He recognized some faces. Lucius Malfoy was conspicuously absent, still serving his sentence, but the man standing in his rough position, holding court in the far corner with 3 other robed figures, was clearly family. Same bone structure, same quality of blonde, same manner of occupying space as though the room had been built specifically for him to stand in it. Cassius Malfoy was perhaps 45, with Lucius's looks and what appeared, on closer inspection, to be considerably more actual intelligence behind his eyes. He caught Harry's entry and his expression did not change, which was itself a kind of statement. Harry filed him away and kept moving. An elderly witch was crossing the room toward him with a speed that her apparent age had no business supporting. She was small, severe, wearing robes the color of old blood, and her eyes were the sharpest thing in the room. She stopped in front of Harry and looked him over from shoes to hairline with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had been assessing people for the better part of a century and had gotten very good at it. "Lord Potter Black," she said. Her voice was dry and precise, like a document being read aloud. "Valentina Marchetti. I hold the Marchetti seat and 2 affiliated proxies." She extended her hand, wrist forward, the old formal way. "I knew your grandfather. James the Elder, I mean, not Fleamont, though I knew Fleamont too. Your grandfather James the Elder did me a considerable service in 1962 that I have never properly repaid. I intend to address that today." Harry gripped her wrist. "Lord Marchetti." "Lady," she corrected, without heat. "Or Valentina, if you're going to be tedious about it. Your grandfather called me Valentina." She looked at Neville, who was doing a remarkable impression of someone who was not at all intimidated by a 90-year-old woman with a stare like a surgical instrument. "Longbottom. Your grandmother is well?" "Very, Lady Marchetti," Neville said. "Good. She owes me a rematch at Gobstones." She looked back at Harry. "There are 22 lords and ladies in that chamber today who will vote with you on anything reasonable, and 3 who will vote with you on things that aren't, because they want the affiliation more than they want the policy. Don't let the last group do that, it makes the whole coalition look unprincipled." She said all of this in the same tone she might use to describe the weather. "There are 6 who will vote against you regardless of what you propose, because opposing the new power is their entire political identity and they're not sophisticated enough to update it. And there is 1, her eyes moved, briefly, to the far corner and Cassius Malfoy, who is sophisticated enough that I'd advise you to watch him very carefully. Not because he's dangerous in the old sense. Because he's dangerous in the new one." "What sense is that?" Harry asked. "He's an intelligent man who has correctly identified that the old order is ending and has decided that the most advantageous position is not to fight it but to redirect it." She looked at Harry with those sharp eyes. "He will try to become your ally. And if he can't, he'll try to become indispensable in some other way. Watch what he wants in exchange for cooperation. That will tell you everything." Harry looked at her with genuine respect. "You've been watching this situation." "I've been watching politics since before your grandfather was born, Lord Potter Black," Valentina Marchetti said, with a tone that was perfectly between dry and fond. "It's the one sport that never gets boring." She turned. "Come. I'll introduce you to the 22 before the session opens. First impressions in this room are the same as first moves in chess. Harry glanced at Neville. Neville gave him a look that clearly said she is absolutely terrifying and I think I love her. Harry completely agreed. They followed Valentina Marchetti into the chamber. The session opened at 10 o'clock with the Wisengamot's chief warlock, a heavy-set man named Thickness who was technically Pious Thickness but had not, as far as Harry could determine, been imperieused recently. The Voldemort infiltration had been forcibly extracted during the Ministry's post-war reconstruction period that nobody had gotten around to completing because the war wasn't actually over yet. He called the session to order with the formal staff strike on the stone floor and looked out at the assembled lords and ladies with an expression that suggested he'd rather be somewhere significantly calmer. Harry sat in the first available Potter seat, a high-backed chair in the third tier, and took stock of the room from above. The seats spread around him in a wide arc. Most were filled. Cassius Malfoy was in the second tier, slightly to Harry's left, positioned so that any glance at the floor would include Harry's section in peripheral vision. Deliberate. Valentina Marchetti was 3 seats to Harry's right and looked as though she'd been sitting in that chair for geological ages. Neville was in the long-bottom seat in the fourth tier, slightly separated from the core of the action, and Harry had watched him straighten in it as the room filled, the way a tree straightens in good soil. Thickness cleared his throat. This emergency session has been called in light of the Gringotts Registry notification received on August 1st, documenting the lordship claims of Harry James Potter to houses Potter, Black, and Peverell, and the pending consolidated claim to 37 additional houses of magical Britain. He paused, consulting his parchment. The session is open for, Lord Avery, you're recognized. A thin man with a grey beard in the upper tier stood immediately. Lord Chief Warlock, I move that this body demand a full accounting from Gringotts of the circumstances surrounding the registry notification, specifically the nature of the circumstances are a matter of Gringotts public record, Harry said. He didn't stand. He didn't need to. His voice carried to every corner of the circular chamber with a clarity that was partly the room's architecture and partly, he suspected, something to do with the ancestral magic that was now properly settled in him, the natural authority of someone claiming what was theirs. Every head in the room turned. Lord Avery looked at him with the slightly startled expression of a man who had not expected to be interrupted and was recalibrating. Lord Potter Black, he said, with the emphasis of someone testing whether the title was real. You are not recognized. I hold 19 seats in this chamber, Harry said pleasantly. I am recognized by a significant plurality of this body. And I'll save everyone some time. Yes, 42 seals were placed on my ancestral inheritances at birth. Yes, they bear a single signature. Yes, Gringotts flagged it, documented it, and has filed a full account with the Wisengamot Registry, which means it is already public record and you may read it at your leisure. Is there a specific aspect you'd like to discuss, Lord Avery? Avery's mouth opened and closed. He sat down, which was probably the wisest thing he'd done all morning. Several people were talking at once now. Thickness struck his staff again. Order. Order. He looked at Harry with the expression of a man dealing with a situation that had not been in his professional preparation. Lord Potter Black. You wish to address the chamber? I do, Harry said, and stood. He hadn't prepared a speech. He'd thought about it. Hermione had offered to help him write one, and he'd known she'd have made it excellent, but he'd decided against it, because a speech was a performance and what he wanted to say wasn't a performance. He looked around the chamber at the assembled lords and ladies of Wizarding Britain, this collection of old names and old money and old power that had been managing the magical world for centuries with varying degrees of success, and he thought about what was true and said it. My name is Harry Potter. Some of you know me from the newspapers. Some of you know my family name. What most of you didn't know, until 3 days ago, is that I've been operating for my entire life with most of my inheritance sealed from me. He let that sit for a moment. I'm not here today to conduct a trial or make accusations. I'm here because I hold 19 seats in this chamber and those seats represent obligations, not just rights, and I intend to fulfill those obligations. He looked around the room, making eye contact with faces here and there, Valentina's sharp eyes, Neville's steady ones, and, briefly, Cassius Malfoy's carefully neutral ones. Voldemort is still active. He has infiltrated this ministry. He has corrupted this chamber. Some of you in this room voted for legislation last year that his people drafted. Some of you knew it. Some of you didn't. That ends now. He sat down. There was a silence that had weight to it. Then Valentina Marchetti stood. Lord Chief Warlock, she said, in a voice that could have cut glass, I move that this chamber formally recognize the lordship claims registered by Lord Potterblack, and further move that the Committee on Magical Inheritances conduct a formal review of any sealed inheritances registered with Gringotts in the last 20 years. She paused. I would like Lord Potterblack's 19 seats counted in the vote. Seconded, said 3 people simultaneously, which created a brief moment of organizational confusion that Thickness navigated with visible relief that someone was doing procedure. The motion passed 47-9. Harry noted which 9 had voted against it and filed them under watch these ones. When the session paused for recess at 11:30, he was approached by 8 different lords and ladies who wanted to introduce themselves, 2 who wanted to discuss specific legislative concerns, and 1 very elderly wizard in robes so dark they appeared to be black holes in human form, who simply stood in front of Harry for a moment, assessed him with eyes the color of deep water, and said, House Selwyn has waited a long time for House Potter to find its feet. Good morning, Lord Potterblack, and walked away before Harry could respond. He was still processing that when Cassius Malfoy appeared at his shoulder. Up close, the man was, Harry had to admit it, impressive in the way that well-maintained power tends to be impressive. Not loud about it. Cassius Malfoy's robes were expensive in the way that meant they'd been made by someone who knew how to make expensive things look effortless, and his manner was the same, effortless in a way that required enormous effort. He was probably 6 feet tall, lean, with his cousin Lucius's coloring but sharper features and, most notably, an absence of the cold contempt that Lucius wore like a second skin. Cassius Malfoy's default expression was something more calibrated. Interested. As though he was genuinely curious about most things and had learned that curiosity was both more effective and more pleasurable than contempt. Lord Potterblack, he said. His voice was pleasant. Medium deep, well modulated, the voice of someone who understood that tone was content. Cassius Malfoy. Congratulations on your recognition today. The vote was decisive. Thank you, Harry said. I didn't vote for it, Cassius said, without the slightest awkwardness. I abstained. I wanted to tell you that directly rather than let you find out from the record. Harry looked at him with interest. Why did you abstain? Because voting yes would have appeared tactical and I prefer not to be read incorrectly on my first recorded interaction with you. And because voting no would have been strategically foolish and I am not a foolish man. He said this without any apparent self-consciousness. I also wanted to tell you that the motion Marchetti filed for the inheritance review is going to unearth several other sealed inheritances that have nothing to do with yours, and some of them will cause considerable disruption. I have a vested interest in how that disruption is managed. Your family has sealed inheritances, Harry said. It wasn't a question. Cassius inclined his head slightly. My family has several things that bear examination. I am, gradually, and with some difficulty, examining them. I wanted you to know that before the examination becomes public, rather than after. He met Harry's eyes directly. It was the directness of someone who'd calculated that directness was the only approach likely to work and was therefore being genuine for strategic reasons, which was its own interesting quality. I am not my cousin. I know, Harry said. Cassius raised an eyebrow slightly, the first time his expression had moved more than minimally. You're not going to tell me to prove it. You just did, Harry said. Coming over here, unprompted, to tell me you abstained and why, and to flag your family's potential issues before they become a problem, that proves it. Not perfectly. But enough for a first conversation. Cassius looked at him for a moment with an expression that was, Harry was fairly certain, genuine surprise, wrapped in a very thin layer of composure that meant it would take most people entirely. "You're not what I expected," he said. "Nobody is what you expect when you've only read about them in newspapers," Harry said. Cassius almost smiled. It was a very careful almost smile, the kind that had practice behind it. "No. I suppose not." He glanced around the chamber, which was refilling as recess ended. "For what it's worth, Lord Potterblack, and I understand if it's worth nothing at this moment, I will not work against you in this chamber. I don't have the votes to block the inheritance review, and I wouldn't want to even if I did. What was done to you," he paused, selecting the next words with care, "is an example of a kind of thinking that has done more damage to this world than it has ever prevented. The idea that the right person managing other people's power for them is safer than letting people hold their own power." He looked at Harry directly. "I disagree with that idea. Strongly. And I am in a position to disagree with it loudly, if the right occasion presents itself." Harry held his gaze for a moment. Marchetti's words from the antechamber were running through his head, "Watch what he wants in exchange for cooperation." "What do you want, Lord Malfoy?" he asked. "Right now," Cassius said. "A chamber that functions. Legislation that doesn't have Voldemort's fingerprints on it. And," he paused, "a seat at the table when the world after this war starts being built. That's all. I'm not asking for absolution. I know what my family has done. I'm asking for the opportunity to do something different with what's left of our standing." Harry said nothing for a moment. He turned it over. Marchetti had warned him that this man was intelligent enough to position himself for the new order rather than defend the old one. That was true. It was also, potentially, useful. The two things were not mutually exclusive. "Then vote for things that deserve votes," Harry said finally. "Not for me. For the things themselves. I'll notice the difference." Cassius inclined his head, a precise, respectful movement. "That's fair," he said, and turned and walked back to his seat. Harry watched him go. "Don't trust him," said a voice at his right shoulder, and he turned to find Valentina Marchetti appearing from nowhere with the unnerving habit of the very old and very sharp. "I don't," Harry said. "But he might be useful." She gave him a look that suggested she was upgrading her assessment of him. "Carefully," she said. "Always," he said. She made a sound that on a less severe face might have been a laugh, and went back to her seat. The afternoon session went 3 hours and covered, in varying degrees of productive order, the inheritance review motion's formal parameters, a request from 7 different lords that Harry submit his consolidated claiming timeline for formal consideration, which he declined with perfect politeness, 2 procedural motions that were obviously designed to create delays and were voted down with Valentina's help, and 1 genuinely significant debate about existing legislation regarding the identification of dark artifacts that Harry had opinions about and expressed them, clearly, with references to 3 specific incidents from his own experience that made the chamber go very quiet. He was good at this, which surprised him, and then, when he thought about it, didn't. He'd been talking people into and out of things since he was 11. He'd been reading rooms and navigating threats since before he could name what he was doing. The fact that the room now had tiered seating and formal procedure and people wearing elaborate robes rather than school uniforms didn't fundamentally change the skill set required. You listened. You picked the right moment. You said the true thing in the clearest way available. By the time the session adjourned at 4 o'clock, 3 new pieces of legislation had been moved, 2 of them with his votes contributing materially to their passage, and the inheritance review motion was formally in committee with a 60-day timeline that Valentina had negotiated to 30 with what appeared to be an effortless combination of procedure mastery and personal intimidation. Harry walked out of the chamber with Neville beside him, both of them quiet in the particular way of people who have done something large and are still absorbing it. "How do you feel?" Harry asked. Neville thought about it. "Like the room was bigger than I thought I could be in," he said, "and then I was in it anyway." He paused. "Gran's going to lose her mind. In a good way. Is there a bad way she loses her mind? Neville gave him a look. You've met my gran. Harry laughed. They walked through the ministry's atrium, back through the bureaucratic machinery of the Wizarding World's administration, past witches and wizards doing afternoon paper shuffling and memo routing, the invisible mechanical hum of a large institution going about its business. At the atrium's exit, they found Ron sitting on a bench eating an enormous sandwich, still in street clothes because he hadn't been invited to sit in the session, not yet, no seat to claim, but present anyway, in the way that Ron was always present, because when Harry walked into complicated situations Ron considered his job to be the person waiting on the other side of them. Well? Ron said, through the sandwich. 19 votes recognized, Harry said. Inheritance review in committee. 2 pieces of legislation passed with our votes contributing. Ron looked at Neville. And you? I sat in the long-bottom seat, Neville said, with a simplicity that was somehow bigger than any elaboration. Ron stood, finished the sandwich in one final bite, and extended his hand to Neville wrist first, the formal way, without making it a performance. Neville looked at it for a moment and then gripped it. Good, Ron said. Just that. And then he looked at Harry. Gripclaw sent a message. He's got the documentation ready for the consolidated claiming ritual. He needs a date. Tomorrow, Harry said. Ron raised his eyebrows. Tomorrow. The Wizengamot registry notification has been out for 2 days. People are paying attention. The consolidated ritual should happen while that attention is current. It'll be harder to quietly minimize the significance if people are already watching. Ron stared at him. You want it to be public. I want people to see 37 houses reclaimed in a single ritual. I want it documented. I want the magical record of it to exist in Gringotts' ledgers with a date and a timestamp and 30 witnesses. Harry met his eyes. Nobody sealed those houses with witnesses present. I'm reclaiming them with a room full of them. Ron was quiet for a moment, and then he said something in a tone Harry had only heard him use a handful of times, a tone that was entirely without irony or humor. Mate. You're going to be someone important. I'm already someone important, Harry said. I just finally know it. Ron grinned, wide and real, the grin that went all the way to his eyes. Right, he said. I'll tell Gripclaw tomorrow. They went back to Grimmauld Place because it was Harry's now, and that still felt strange and would probably feel strange for a while, the way reclaimed things sometimes feel strange even when they're good, the adjustment to the new size of yourself. Creature had spent 2 days in a state of existential conflict. His loyalty to the Black family line was absolute and ancient and deeply felt, and Harry was the Black heir, which meant, by Creature's impeccable logic, that Harry was to be served. But Harry was also the person his previous mistress had despised above almost all others, which created a cognitive situation that the old house elf was navigating by cleaning everything in the house with the focused energy of someone who needed somewhere to put a lot of feeling. The kitchen was spotless. The sitting room was spotless. The hallway with the portrait of Walburga Black had been, Harry had been surprised to find, carefully cleaned around the portrait, not including it, in a very precise demonstration of Creature's internal compromise on the matter. Harry had looked at Walburga's portrait and made a decision. He'd pulled a chair up in front of it and sat down, and Walburga's painted eyes had opened with the immediate readiness to be furious, and Harry had said, before she could start, I'm Lord Black. I'm Sirius's heir. This is my house. He'd let that sit for a moment. I know what you think of me. I know what Sirius thought of you. I don't care about any of that. But this is my house and you are a portrait in it, and we can figure out an arrangement or I can have the portrait removed. He'd paused. Your choice. Walburga had stared at him with the particular hatred of the very proud confronted with the very certain. And then, slowly, with all the grace of a glacier changing direction, she had closed her eyes. Not agreement. But silence. Which was, from Walburga Black, a form of recognition. He'd taken it. Now it was evening, and the kitchen was warm with the smell of whatever Creature had produced for dinner, something involving chicken and a great deal of determination, and Hermione was at the table with 3 books open and a quill going rapidly across a 4th piece of parchment, which meant she'd been working since they'd left and had found something important. Ron and Neville were at the other end of the table going over Neville's account of the session in a way that was turning into a genuine conversation about Wisengamot procedure, which was more politically sophisticated than either of them would have claimed to be last year. Harry sat down across from Hermione. "What did you find?" She looked up, and her eyes had the particular brightness of discovery. "Sirius's legal route," she said. "The Wisengamot historical precedent." He was on to something, Harry. He found a case from 1834 where a sealed inheritance was retroactively challenged on the grounds that the sealing party exceeded their guardian authority. The case established that a magical guardian's authority over inheritance magic is bounded by the interests of the ward, not the interests of the guardian's own judgment. She turned the parchment to face him. "What Dumbledore did, proceeding over your mother's explicit objection, that's directly relevant to this precedent. It doesn't just make the seals morally wrong. It may make them legally invalid ab initio. From the very beginning." Harry looked at the parchment. At the case reference. Ab initio. Meaning not just that they should be removed, but that they were never legally valid to begin with. She met his eyes. Which means the 31 years of suppressed inheritance aren't just a wrong to be acknowledged. They're a compensable loss. Under old Wisengamot law, the party who placed illegal seals is liable for the value of what was withheld. The kitchen was quiet except for Creature's movements at the stove. "Hermione," Harry said. "I know. I don't want his money," Harry said immediately, because that mattered and needed to be said clearly. "I'm not pursuing this for compensation. I don't need it and I don't want to turn this into something that looks like, I know," she said again, more firmly. "But you should know the legal reality. Not to use it as a weapon. To understand the full scope of what happened to you. And because," she paused. "Because if that precedent is valid, it affects not just you. The Inheritance Review Committee is going to be looking at other sealed inheritances. Some of them may have been sealed by people with much worse motivations than Dumbledore's. Families who were targeted deliberately. Who lost things that weren't accidentally withheld but maliciously taken." She held his gaze. "This could be bigger than you." Harry sat with that for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Keep developing it. But carefully, I want to use it the right way." She nodded, already turning back to her parchment. He looked around the kitchen, Ron and Neville talking in the corner, the clean surfaces, the warm light, the rings on his hand catching it. Tomorrow was the consolidated ritual. 37 houses in one room, with witnesses. He thought about what his mother's memory had said, "You are more than I had time to tell you." He was beginning to understand what she'd meant. From the hallway, Walburga's portrait was completely silent for the first time in possibly decades, and in that silence was something almost like respect, paid by someone who had no capacity for it through the only mechanism available to the portrait of a very proud woman. She simply did not deny what she was looking at. Harry Potter, Lord of 4 houses and counting, sitting at the kitchen table of number 12 Grimmauld Place, planning how to rebuild the world more fairly than he'd found it. Not because anyone had asked him to. Because it was his, and he was going to do something worthy of it. Chapter 4, Unsealing the ritual chamber beneath Gringotts was nothing like the granite room upstairs. Where Gripclaw's office was austere and functional, this space was ancient in a way that made Hogwarts feel recently built. The walls were carved from bedrock that had never seen daylight, and the carvings on them weren't decorative, they were mathematical, precise sequences of goblin script that Hermione was visibly fighting the urge to stop and read, her eyes tracking along them as they walked in. The floor was a single continuous piece of black stone, seamless, polished to a depth that made it look less like a surface and more like a window into something below. The ceiling was vaulted and high enough that the top of it was lost in shadow. 12 goblin witnesses stood at measured intervals around the room's perimeter, each holding a lantern that burned white rather than the greenish light of the upper corridors. They were absolutely still. They had the quality of things that had been standing in exactly this position for a very long time and planned to continue indefinitely. Gripclaw stood at the chamber's center beside a stone plinth roughly hip height, on which rested a document that was clearly the consolidated claiming instrument, several pages of parchment so old it had gone the color of old cream, covered in script in 3 languages, with 37 seals pressed into the bottom margin in a row like a sentence. One of those seals, Harry noticed, was slightly larger than the others and pressed in a different metal. He'd know that seal anywhere. Purple wax, ornate signature, the particular confidence of a man who had believed for 15 years that he was doing the right thing. Harry walked to the plinth without being asked. Ron, Hermione, and Neville stood behind him. They'd arrived together, which Gripclaw had permitted without comment, which Harry took as another expression of the goblin's particular form of solidarity. Behind them, ranged along the chamber's entrance wall, were 7 additional witnesses: Valentina Marchetti, who had appeared at Gringotts at 8:45 that morning with 2 junior members of her family in tow, saying she had decided to witness the ritual because historical events should be witnessed by people who understand history. Lord Selwyn, the ancient dark-robed figure who had spoken to Harry at the Wisengamot and then appeared at Grimmauld Place this morning without any explanation Harry could identify, and 4 others who had sent formal requests to Gripclaw's office once the word had spread, all of them houses with some connection to the 40 that had been sealed. Cassius Malfoy was not among them. Harry noted the absence without drawing conclusions from it. Not yet. The consolidated claiming ritual, Gripclaw said, addressing the room with the specific gravity of someone beginning a formal proceeding, is a process with no modern precedent. The last consolidated claiming on record was performed in 1491, when Lord William Gryffindor reclaimed 6 secondary houses following a contested succession. Today's ritual involves 37 houses and has been validated by Gringotts' Senior Ritual Council. He looked at Harry. Lord Potter Black. You understand that this ritual, once begun, cannot be interrupted without significant magical consequence? Yes, Harry said. You understand that the claiming is permanent and irrevocable, and that the ancestral magic of each house will integrate with your own upon claiming? Yes. You understand, Gripclaw paused, just briefly, just enough, that the experience may be intense. Harry thought about the memory vessels, about the Gryffindor claiming that had happened without warning on the night bus. I understand. Gripclaw nodded once. Then place both hands on the instrument and speak your full name and lineage. Harry put his hands flat on the parchment. It was warm, the way the ledger stone had been warm, but more so, actively warm, like something that had been waiting to be touched and was reacting to contact with a kind of urgency. He could feel, beneath his palms, the 37 seals as though they were physical rather than symbolic, distinct pressures, each one different, some heavier than others. Harry James Potter, he said. Son of James Charles Potter of House Potter. Son of Lily Jane Potter, born Evans, heir of Prince, descended of Peveril through the maternal Gryffindor branch. Godson of Sirius Orion Black of House Black. Lord of Houses Potter, Black, Peveril, and Gryffindor. He looked at Gripclaw. I claim what is mine. The room answered him. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like the room deciding to pay attention, the white lanterns flaring simultaneously without changing their quality, the temperature dropping by several degrees in the same instant, the stone floor doing something subtle under his feet that he felt through his shoes, a vibration too deep to be heard but entirely possible to feel. The parchment under his hands began to glow, starting at his palms and spreading outward along the lines of text, working its way toward the seals. The first seal broke like a lock turning. The magic hit him immediately, a wave of it, not violent but enormous, the way a large wave isn't violent but is absolutely impossible to remain unaffected by. His chest expanded. Something in the back of his skull lit up with the warm amber light he recognized from the ledger stone, and information arrived, a house's history, its magic, its character, not in words but in the way music communicates, direct and below language. He held on to the plinth and kept his feet and kept his face steady. The second seal broke. The third. By the fifth he had stopped counting and was simply experiencing it, house after house coming online inside him like windows in a dark building getting lights switched on behind them, each one its own particular quality of magic. Some were ancient and cold, magic that had been sitting sealed for 15 years and was coming out with the particular energy of compressed things releasing. Some were smaller, warmer, more personal, minor houses whose magic was less about power and more about legacy, about craft, about specific regional knowledge of the magical world that had nowhere to go for 15 years and was now, suddenly, somewhere. House Slytherin arrived at the 17th seal. He'd been ready for it, intellectually. The gaunt inheritance, by conquest right, by the logic of magical bloodline law that recognized Voldemort's repeated magical self-mutilation as an abandonment of family claim. He'd known it was coming. He was not entirely prepared for what it felt like. It was cold. Not unpleasantly cold, more like the cold of deep water, which is uncomfortable at the surface and clarifying further down. It was old in a way that none of the others had been old. Slytherin's line went back to the founders, and the founders had been something else entirely, something the modern magical world had retained only traces of, and those traces arrived in Harry with the weight of genuine age behind them. Parseltongue was already in him, had been for years, but the Slytherin claiming deepened it, made it something more complex than a language, made it a sensitivity to certain categories of old magic that spoke in similar registers. He felt it settle alongside everything else without conflict, without the strangeness he'd expected. He was a Gryffindor and a Slytherin both, and the two sat in him without fighting because he was the thing that held them rather than the thing being held by either. The 23rd seal was the heaviest. It broke with a crack that everyone in the room heard, not loud, not sharp, but resonant, the sound of something very large being done. The warmth that followed it went through Harry from his hands to his feet in a single continuous motion, and several things happened simultaneously. His hair stood up, not from static but from something the air did in response to the magic. The black stone floor reflected his face back at him clearly for the first time, as though the depth it had been looking into had become illuminated, and somewhere behind his breastbone, something that had been pressed in a specific direction for 15 years straightened, the way a plant straightens after the weight that bent it is removed. He heard Hermione make a short involuntary sound behind him. He heard one of the goblin witnesses say something in gobbledygook, quickly, to the one nearest them, and the nearest one's response was a single syllable that carried considerable feeling. He kept his hands on the parchment. Kept going. The last seal, the 37th, was the smallest, a minor landed house in the Scottish borders with a history that was mostly agricultural and a magic that was mostly weather-related, and when it broke it was almost gentle after what had come before, like the last note of a very long chord resolving. The parchment stopped glowing. The warmth in his hands faded slowly, deliberately, as though the magic was making sure everything was properly seated before stepping back. Harry lifted his hands from the plinth. He stood up straight. The room was very quiet. The 12 goblin witnesses were still holding their lanterns, but every one of them had their eyes on him, and he was aware that the room looked different from this position, or rather, he looked different from inside it, could feel the edges of himself extending past where they'd been that morning, not outward physically but in the way that things extend when they're finally their full size. He turned around. Hermione's eyes were bright and she was doing the not-shedding thing again. Ron was standing with his arms at his sides and his jaw slightly forward in the expression he wore when he was moved and was absolutely not going to say so until later in private. Neville was looking at Harry the way Harry had sometimes caught people looking at a thing they'd watched become true, a look that was part awe and part vindication and entirely genuine. Valentina Marchetti was nodding, slowly, once, the way someone nods when a thing they expected to happen finally does. Lord Selwyn had his eyes closed. His lips were moving slightly, and it took Harry a moment to realize the old man was saying something that might have been a prayer, or might have been a formal acknowledgement in some older tradition, the kind of thing that had been done at significant moments for so long that the words had worn smooth with use. 40 houses, Gripclaw said. He was looking at his ledger, quill moving. All claims registered. Gringotts formally recognizes Harry James Potter as Lord of Houses Potter, Black, Peverell, Gryffindor, Slytherin. He continued through the list, all 40 names, reading them in the precise even tone of professional documentation, and each name landed in the room like a stone landing in water, making circles. When he finished, Harry said, "Thank you, Gripclaw." "Gringotts keeps records," Gripclaw said. Then he looked up from his ledger, directly at Harry, and added, "It has been an honor to keep this one." They came out of Gringotts at 1 in the afternoon into a Diagon alley that was, for once, doing something Harry had not asked it to do and could not have predicted. It was watching him. Not in the way it had watched him over the years, the whispers and pointing of the famous boy, the chosen one, the scar-enlightening spectacle. This was different. The people in the alley, shopping families, Hogwarts students with their parents doing early back-to-school preparation, shopkeepers visible in their doorways, were looking at him with something that was less about recognition and more about sensation, the magical world's particular awareness of significant magic having been done. He didn't know how much they'd felt from the street above. Enough, apparently. He walked through it without stopping, heading for the leaky cauldron, with Ron and Hermione and Neville close. Behind him, he could feel the weight of 40 houses like a cloak that fit perfectly after years of wearing something 3 sizes wrong. It was not uncomfortable. It was not overwhelming. It was simply what it was, the full version of himself, moving through the world at full size for the first time. They were halfway through the alley when the first Death Eater operated in. 3 cracks, almost simultaneous, one at the alley's Diagon end, one at the Gringotts end cutting off their route back, one on the rooftop of Madame Malkin's that Harry clocked because his peripheral awareness had expanded significantly in the last 2 hours and registered the movement where previously he might have been half a second slower. Masks and dark robes and wands already out, the aggressive combat-ready posture of people who had been told this was an ambush and had been expecting an easy target. Harry already had his wand in his hand before the 3rd crack finished echoing. "Neville, left," he said, fast and quiet. "Ron, the rooftop one." He didn't look to see if they complied because he knew they would. 3 years of shared danger had made them collectively faster than the sum of their parts. The one at the Gringotts end moved first, sending a killing curse that Harry sidestepped without particular urgency, stepping to the right so the curse went past him and scored a black line along the wall of the apothecary. People in the alley were scattering, shouting, and Harry sent a blasting hex at the ground in front of the Death Eater that threw the man off his feet and into the wall of Ollivanders with a crash that Harry was distantly sorry about because he liked that shop, but priorities were priorities. The one at the alley entrance, the Diagon Street end, was more cautious. He stayed at distance, using the cover of the alley's narrowing, and launched a series of rapid curses in sequence rather than committing to one. Harry walked toward him. This was the thing that happened now, the thing that 37 houses and 15 years of sealed magic had made possible. He wasn't running, wasn't dodging frantically the way he would have 2 days ago. He moved through the barrage with something that was less like evasion and more like understanding. The ancestral magic had brought with it combat knowledge, 3 generations of it, practical magic worked out over centuries of people who had survived things by being extremely good at this particular art. He batted aside curses with shield charms that barely cost him effort, redirected 2 of them with a wand movement that was older than modern combat magic and more efficient, and closed the distance between himself and the Death Eater in about 4 seconds. When he was 10 feet away he said, very clearly, "Drop it." The Death Eater sent a killing curse at point-blank range. Harry twisted, not quite as fast as possible, fast enough, and the curse went past his ear close enough that he felt the displacement of air, and he hit the Death Eater with a binding curse that had enough force behind it to crack the flagstones when it landed and left the man wrapped in magical restraints so tight he couldn't breathe loudly, let alone cast. He turned around. Ron had dealt with the rooftop one, the man was on the ground in the alley, unconscious, which Ron managed with what was becoming a very competent offensive stunning combination that Harry had watched him develop over the last year. Neville had the 3rd one, the one Harry had sent him to, backed against the wall of Madame Malkin's and bound with an incarcerus that was wrapped 3 times because Neville, once committed, was thorough. 15 seconds, approximately. The alley was silent except for the distant sounds of evacuating shoppers and the creak of something in Ollivander's wall settling after the impact. Harry looked at the 3 bound Death Eaters and then at his friends. Ron had a small burn on the back of his hand from a deflected curse. Neville's robes were scorched at the shoulder. Hermione had taken cover behind an upturned cart. She was already emerging, wand out, eyes moving across the alley with the rapid assessment of someone checking for additional threats. "Anyone else?" Harry said. "I don't think so," Hermione said. She was checking angles, the way she did. 3. It was 3. "An ambush with 3 people," Ron said, looking at the bound Death Eaters with an expression that was partly incredulous and partly offended on Harry's behalf. "They sent 3. They didn't know about the ritual," Neville said. He was rubbing the scorched shoulder with the matter-of-fact manner of someone who has stopped being surprised by the scorching of his robes. "They thought they were hitting Harry Potter, Chosen One, on his way out of Gringotts. They didn't know what they were actually hitting." Harry looked at the nearest bound Death Eater, the cautious one from the alley entrance, who was now staring up at him from the flagstones with an expression that had moved rapidly from professional menace to something considerably more complicated. Harry crouched down to his level. He pulled the mask off, not roughly, just matter-of-factly, and looked at the face underneath. Young, mid-20s, maybe, with a fear in his eyes that was doing battle with something that was still trying to be defiant. "I'm going to need you to carry a message," Harry said, conversationally, as though they were meeting under different circumstances. "When the Aurors arrive, and they will, shortly, you're going to be processed. At some point you're going to be in a position where you can communicate with whoever sent you." He met the man's eyes. "Tell them it was 40 houses. Not one. All 40. And tell them what 15 seconds felt like." He stood up. "They should adjust their expectations accordingly." The man stared at him. Aurors arrived in the next 3 minutes, 4 of them, operating in with the slightly breathless quality of people who'd gotten a magical incident alert and were expecting something worse than what they found. The ranking one, a sharp-faced witch named Proudfoot, took stock of the scene with practiced efficiency and then looked at Harry with an expression that was recalibrating in real time. 3, Lord Potterblack, she said. 3, Harry agreed. "Alive and unharmed. I'd like a receipt for the handover, if you don't mind, formal record." Proudfoot looked at him for a long moment. "Of course," she said, and there was something in her voice that might have been reassessment, the kind that happens when a person you thought you understood does something that revises the category you'd put them in. Harry took the receipt, folded it, put it in his pocket. They walked the rest of the way to the leaky cauldron with a bit more space than before. The crowd had thinned dramatically and then re-thickened with the specific energy of people who want to see what happened and are watching from safer distances. Harry walked through them and didn't slow down. Tom the barman had a table cleared for them before they were fully through the door and produced 4 butterbeers and what appeared to be an entire pie without being asked, which Harry suspected meant word traveled fast in Diagon Alley, and Tom had excellent instincts about what a person needed after a magical confrontation. Ron sat down, drank half his butterbeer in one pull, and said, 15 seconds. "Thereabouts," Harry said. "You walked toward the one who was throwing curses at you. The distance was an advantage for him. Removing the distance removed the advantage." Ron stared at him. "You know what's weird? I completely understand that reasoning and it still looked completely mental from where I was standing." He paused. "Also, you told the Aurors you wanted a receipt." "Documentation," Harry said. Gripclaw's influence. Neville was eating pie with the focus of someone who had burned considerable adrenaline and needed to replace it immediately. He looked up. "They're going to send more next time. And better ones." "I know," Harry said. "Good." Neville said it simply, and went back to the pie, and there was something in his directness that was entirely satisfying. Hermione had her notebook open, she'd produced it from somewhere, she always had a notebook, and was writing. "The combat magic you used," she said, without looking up. "The redirection of the 2 curses. That wasn't standard." "No," Harry agreed. "It came with the claiming. Ancestral combat technique," House Murden, I think, that's the one with the oldest offensive deflection tradition. Came in on the 28th seal. She looked up from her notebook. You can identify which house each technique came from. He thought about it. Yes, he said, somewhat surprised to find this was true. It's like, knowing which hand you're writing with. I know where it sits. She wrote something. Then, Harry, we need to talk about Voldemort's response to today. The ritual and the Death Eaters, those two things happening on the same day aren't a coincidence. He knew about the ritual. He knew you'd be at Gringotts. Someone told him, Ron said, flatly. Or he's had the ministry under surveillance, Neville said. The Wizengamot session was yesterday. We were open about the consolidated ritual's timing. Either way, Harry said, he knows now. He knows about the 40 houses. He knows what happened in 15 seconds with 3 of his people. He wrapped his hands around his butterbeer. Which means he's going to change his approach. Hermione set down her quill. You said something to the Death Eater. Tell them to adjust their expectations. You meant Voldemort specifically. Yes. You want him to know what he's dealing with before he commits to a strategy. I want him to make decisions based on accurate information rather than whatever he currently thinks I am, Harry said. He's been operating with a model of me that's 15 years out of date, the chosen one, the boy who survived, a threat to be managed or eliminated. That model is wrong now. He looked around the table at the 3 of them. He's intelligent. Give him correct information and he makes smarter moves. Smarter moves are more predictable moves. You're trying to make him rational, Hermione said slowly, working through it. I'm trying to stop him making decisions on assumptions about me that aren't true anymore. Dangerous assumptions are dangerous for everyone, Neville finished. He was looking at Harry with the thoughtful expression he developed this year, the one that meant he was thinking in political terms, in military terms, terms he hadn't had before and was learning to use. If he thinks you're weaker than you are, he commits too many resources to the wrong strategy. If he thinks you're stronger than you are, he might pull back or retreat. But if he knows exactly what you are, he has to actually think, Harry said. He has to actually engage with the reality of the situation rather than a convenient fiction about it. He paused. He's not stupid, Tom Riddle. He never was. He makes mistakes when he's arrogant. I'm removing the arrogance. The table was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of 4 people who have followed a chain of reasoning to a conclusion that is both logical and slightly terrifying. Right, said Ron. He picked up his butterbeer again. So. Not dead today, Voldemort updated, 40 houses claimed, 19 Wizengamot seats recognized. He looked at Harry. Productive birthday week. It's only Thursday, Harry said. Ron blinked. It's only, he looked at the ceiling. It's only Thursday, he repeated. Right. He drank his butterbeer. What's Friday, then? Friday turned out to be a letter. It arrived at Grimmauld Place at 7 in the morning by a method Harry hadn't seen before, not an owl, not a Patronus, not a howler. The envelope simply appeared on the kitchen table between one moment and the next, between Harry's hand reaching for the teapot and the teapot being where the teapot was, and the envelope was between them in the space where nothing had been, without sound, without magical signature, without anything. Black envelope. No crest. No seal. The outside carried only a single line of handwriting that was ornate and old-fashioned in the particular way of someone who had learned to write in an era when handwriting was taught as a formal discipline, for Lord Potterblack. Personal correspondence. The content will be of interest. Harry set down the teapot. Picked up the envelope. Turned it over. Hermione appeared in the kitchen doorway in her dressing gown, already reading something, hair performing its morning exercises. She looked at the envelope. What's that? Just appeared, Harry said. She put down her own reading immediately, which told him she understood the significance of a letter that appeared without mechanism. Don't open it without, he'd already opened it. She made a small sound of exasperated affection that he ignored because the letter was open and he was reading it, and the first 3 words were enough to tell him that the next several days were going to be interesting in a way that Thursday's events had only been a preview of. The letter was from Voldemort. Not from a Death Eater. Not from an intermediary. From Voldemort himself. Harry knew it immediately, not just from the handwriting's quality but from the particular way the words were arranged, the intelligence of the construction, the complete absence of the theatrical menace that characterized Voldemort's public proclamations. This was a private letter from an extremely intelligent man who had decided that a particular situation warranted direct communication. Lord Potterblack, it began, with the title, which told Harry more than the words that followed in some ways. Voldemort acknowledging the title was Voldemort acknowledging the reality. 3 of my people were sent to meet you yesterday. I am told the encounter lasted approximately 15 seconds and that you offered them courtesy you were not obligated to offer. I was told you sent them with a message. I have received the message and I am, accordingly, adjusting my expectations. You have accomplished something in 4 days that I spent decades trying to accomplish through force, the consolidation of ancestral power sufficient to reshape the political landscape of magical Britain. I am not writing to congratulate you. I am writing because I am a practical man, and practical men communicate directly when the situation makes directness more efficient than alternatives. You know what I want. I have been entirely consistent about what I want for 30 years, magical supremacy, the removal of Muggle-born magical governance of a world they did not build, and the recognition of what magic truly is and what its holders are owed by a world that does not recognize them. Some of what I want, you would find indefensible. Some of what I want, if you examine it without the lens of how you have been told to see me, you might find less indefensible than you expect. I am not offering alliance. I know you too well for that, and I suspect you know yourself too well to consider it. What I am offering is a conversation, without pretense, without the theatrical combat that neither of us particularly benefits from at this moment. You have things I want to understand. I have things that might interest you. If you are willing, I know a way to communicate that involves neither spies nor risks. If you are not, the alternative is what it has always been, and both of us know how much has been wasted in that alternative. I remain, as I have always been, your sincerest adversary. T.M. Riddle. Harry read it twice. He put it on the table. Hermione had moved closer as he read, and she read it now over his shoulder in silence, and he watched her face go through a sequence of reactions that she managed with admirable control until she got to the signature, at which point she sat down. He's using his birth name, she said. Yes. He never uses his birth name. He used it with me once. In the Chamber of Secrets. Harry stared at the letter. He's doing something with the honesty of it. Using Riddle rather than Voldemort it's a gesture. It means something about the register he's pitching this conversation in. He's being direct, Hermione said slowly. He's being Tom Riddle, Harry said. The brilliant boy who became this because he was afraid of death and powerful enough to think the answer to fear was domination. He paused. I think he's genuinely curious. About me. About what the 40 houses means. He spent 30 years with a model of the world that has him as the most powerful magical entity in Britain, and in 4 days, the model shifted, Hermione said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? Harry looked at the letter. He thought about everything in it, the intelligence of it, the careful precision of some of what I want, if you examine it without the lens of how you have been told to see me. There was truth in it and manipulation wound through the truth like wire through clay, and the thing about Tom Riddle was that he was genuine and dangerous in the same breath and you had to keep both in view simultaneously. I'm going to reply, Harry said. Hermione looked at him. What? He's offering communication, Harry said. Communication means information. Information about his plans, his network, his thinking. A conversation with Voldemort, real conversation, not battlefield confrontation, is the most significant intelligence opportunity this war has produced. He looked at her. And I'm not afraid of him. She stared at him for a long moment, this girl who was the most rigorous thinker he knew, who ran every calculation, who had saved his life repeatedly with precisely this quality of careful thinking. She stared at him and then nodded, slowly, the nod of someone who has run the calculation and reached the same answer with a different method. Write the reply carefully, she said. I know. I want to read it before it goes. Obviously. She picked up his tea, which he hadn't drunk, and drank it herself with the focused look of someone who needed the warmth while they thought. He's going to try to make a case, she said. For some version of what he wants. He's going to use the sealed houses. He's going to use Dumbledore, use the fact that the same system that's supposed to protect the magical world was the thing that suppressed you. He's going to say the system is broken and he's the alternative. I know, Harry said. And parts of what he says will be true. I know that too. She looked at him. How are you going to answer the parts that are true? Harry looked at the letter one more time, at the signature, T.M. Riddle, and thought about a 15-year-old boy writing his name in fire in a dark chamber 100 feet underground, rearranging the letters of who he was into the name of what he intended to become. He thought about power, what it was actually for, what you did with it when it was finally fully yours. By doing something better with them, he said. Hermione looked at him for a moment, and then she refilled her tea and picked up a fresh piece of parchment and pushed it across the table. Then let's write, she said. Chapter 5, The Weight of 40 Names. The reply took 3 hours to write. Not because Harry didn't know what he wanted to say, he knew almost immediately, with the same bone-deep clarity that had been settling into him all week, but because the thing he wanted to say needed to be precise. This was not a letter you dashed off. This was a letter that would be read by the most dangerous mind in Wizarding Britain, a mind that parsed language for weakness the way a surgeon parsed flesh for arteries, and every word needed to be exactly the word intended. Hermione sat across from him for all 3 hours, reading each draft he pushed toward her, marking her thoughts in the margin in her small precise handwriting. She did not try to change what he was saying, only how he was saying it, tightening, clarifying, removing anything that could be read as uncertainty or as invitation beyond what Harry intended. Ron had come down at 8, read the Voldemort letter over Harry's shoulder, gone entirely still for approximately 4 seconds, and then sat down at the table and said, "Right. What do we need?" This was, Harry had long since understood, Ron's version of support, not emotional processing first, action first, processing folded in along the way. Someone to make sure Neville knows about this, Harry said. And to send a message to Gripclaw. He should know a letter arrived this way, without mechanism. He'll want to know the method. Ron was on his feet before Harry finished the sentence. By the time the reply was drafted, Neville had arrived, read the letter, said, "He's scared of you," with the straightforward certainty of someone who had been studying an enemy for a long time, and sat down to eat toast while Hermione and Harry finished the final version. The letter, in its completed form, was 3 paragraphs. Lord Riddle, I received your message. I note the name you used. I'm using it too, because the same honesty that makes it worth noting makes it worth matching. I will have the conversation you're proposing. Not because I'm afraid of what you might say, and not because I find your position sympathetic. Because I am done with this war being fought in the dark, and I have things to say to you that deserve saying directly. You should know going in, I will not be persuaded to inaction by correct diagnoses of broken systems. A correct diagnosis offered by someone whose cure is worse than the disease is not an argument. It is a trap dressed as insight. I know the difference. The method you referenced, I am willing to use it, once. Name the time. H.J. Potterblack. Hermione read the final version twice. The second paragraph, she said. The trap dressed as insight line. Too much. No, she said. It's exactly right. It tells him you've already thought through what he's going to try. She paused. He'll respect it. Which is either good or complicated. Both, Harry said. Both, she agreed. He sealed the letter and placed it on the table. It disappeared in the same way the envelope had arrived, between one moment and the next, without mechanism, without sound. Neville watched it go with his eyes tracking to the empty space where it had been. Whatever method he uses to send those, Neville said, Gripclaw should know about it. That kind of appearance without signature is serious magic. I've already sent word to Gripclaw, Ron said, from behind his mug. He replied in about 12 minutes. Said he'd look into it and that, and I quote, the goblins have opinions about correspondence magic that bypasses conventional channels. He seemed, Ron paused, searching for the word. Professionally offended. Good, Harry said. Let him be offended in a productive direction. The Wisengamot inquiry opened on Monday. Harry had known it was coming. The Inheritance Review Committee had fast-tracked it with Valentina Marchetti's 30-day timeline and, apparently, a unanimous decision by the committee's 5 members that the situation warranted expedited process. What he hadn't known, until Gripclaw sent a memo on Saturday morning, was that the inquiry's scope had been expanded. It was no longer just about the sealed houses. Hermione read the memo over Harry's shoulder and said, they're looking at Dumbledore's guardian authority. Not just the seals, the entire framework of decisions he made as Harry's appointed guardian. The legal validity of all of them. That's, Harry stopped. Thought about it. That's bigger than I intended. I know, she said. But it's not wrong. He sat with that for a moment. It wasn't wrong. If the guardian authority Dumbledore had wielded was legally questionable in the way the 1834 precedent suggested, then every decision he'd made on Harry's behalf, every deferral, every placement, every choice that Harry had had no say in, was subject to the same scrutiny. Privet Drive. The Dursleys. The delayed audit. 31 letters turned away. The specific quality of preparation, or lack of it, that Harry had been given for a war that Dumbledore had known was coming. The scope of it was very large. He dressed carefully on Monday morning in robes he'd had made over the weekend, not ceremonial, not ostentatious, but properly fitted, dark green with the Potter and black crests worked into the lapels in small precise embroidery, and the 3 visible rings on his right hand. He looked in the mirror in the Grimmauld Place hallway and thought, briefly, about all the versions of himself that had stood in this hallway in various states of fear or confusion or grief, and then he went downstairs and ate breakfast and went to do the next thing. The inquiry chamber was smaller than the full Wisengamot chamber, a committee room in the ministry's 4th floor that held perhaps 40 people and had a semicircular arrangement of seats facing a central witness area. The 5 committee members sat behind a curved table at the chamber's head. Valentina Marchetti was one of them, which Harry had expected. A Lord Whitmore, 2 witches he recognized from the registry as senior Wisengamot members, and Thickness as observer, which meant the chief warlock was watching without voting, a sign that the institution was taking the proceedings seriously enough to monitor directly without influencing. Harry sat in the front row. Dumbledore was already there. He was seated in the witness area, not yet being questioned, waiting, his robes the deep plum purple he'd worn for as long as Harry had known him, his half-moon glasses on, his hands folded in his lap with the stillness of someone who had been sitting with something for a long time and had finished fighting it. He looked, Harry thought, genuinely old. Not in the way he usually looked old. Dumbledore's age was normally a quality of accumulated authority, of a life that had been long and significant and left its marks as wisdom rather than weight. This was different. This was the age of a man carrying something. He caught Harry's eye when Harry sat down. He nodded once. Harry nodded back. Hermione was beside Harry. Ron was behind them with Neville. Gripclaw had sent 2 goblin representatives who sat in the back row with the contained attention of people who intended to remember every word of this and had the professional capacity to do so. Lord Whitmore opened the session with the formal preamble. The inquiry, he said, was not a criminal proceeding. It was a review of guardian authority and magical obligation under wizarding law, specifically as it related to the sealed inheritances documented in Gringotts' filed account. Dumbledore would be asked questions. He was permitted to answer in full. The committee would evaluate. Then he said, We'll begin with the matter of the seals themselves. Professor Dumbledore, on July 31, 1980, you placed 42 ritual seals on the ancestral inheritances of Harry James Potter. Is this accurate? It is, Dumbledore said. You were acting in your capacity as the child's appointed magical guardian. I was acting in that capacity, yes. And you acted without the consent of the child's mother, Lily Potter, who according to the documentation filed by Gringotts explicitly objected to the sealing? A pause. Brief. Yes. Whitmore made a note. And without the consent of the child's father, James Potter, who according to the same documentation expressed reservations but ultimately deferred to his wife's objection? Yes. You proceeded regardless. I did. Whitmore looked at him over his reading glasses. Why? Dumbledore looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked up at the committee with the clear-eyed honesty of someone who had made his decision about how to conduct himself in this room. Because I believed the child's survival was the most important immediate priority, and because I believed his access to the full scope of his ancestral inheritance would compromise that survival before he was old enough to manage it. I believed that a powerful, politically visible heir to 40 houses was a more complex target than a child known primarily as a survivor of a single magical attack. He paused. I was wrong. Not in the reasoning was sound for a specific set of assumptions. I was wrong in the assumptions. I assumed that the threat model I had constructed was complete and accurate. I assumed I had correctly weighted the costs. I had not. You continued the seals for 15 years, Lord Whitmore said. After the initial threat, Voldemort's first fall, you continued them. Yes. Why? Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Because the war was not over. Because I still believed the threat model was essentially correct, even as the specific threat had changed in form. And because, he stopped. Started again, with the particular precision of someone reaching for honesty past the easier version. Because at some point, the decision to continue became easier than the decision to undo. To undo it would have required this conversation. This accounting. I found reasons to defer that accounting, year after year. He looked, briefly, at Harry. That was not courage. I am aware of that. The room was very quiet. Valentina Marchetti spoke for the first time. Her voice was dry and precise and absolutely without mercy. Professor Dumbledore. You are considered by most of this world to be its greatest living magical authority. You have made decisions affecting the entire magical community for the better part of a century, and the majority of those decisions have been either correct or defensible. She let that sit for a moment. In your assessment, and I am asking for your genuine assessment, not a courteous deflection, was there any point at which the sealed inheritances went from being a defensible decision to being a wrong one? Dumbledore looked at her steadily. Yes, he said. The moment Voldemort returned, in Harry's 4th year. At that point the threat model had been confirmed, the war had resumed, and Harry was about to engage in active conflict against a returned Dark Lord. I should have unsealed everything then, given him the full scope of what was his, and trusted him to be capable of managing it. He paused. I did not. I told myself the timing was wrong, that he needed stability, that the additional political complexity of 40 houses would distract from the immediate danger. A pause, longer this time. I was wrong. I was not being cautious. I was being unwilling to face what I had done. Marchetti nodded once. Made a note. The questioning went on for 2 hours. Harry watched all of it without speaking. He'd been given the opportunity to address the committee and had said he'd do so after Dumbledore's questioning was complete. He sat with his hands loose in his lap and he listened to one of the most powerful men in the wizarding world systematically account for 15 years of choices, and what he felt, which surprised him slightly, was not satisfaction. It was not the clean feeling of justice delivered, which was what he'd imagined this might feel like. It was something more complicated. It was the feeling of watching a genuinely good person sit in the full weight of a genuinely wrong thing, and there was no pleasure in that. Only the necessity of it. When Whitmore finally looked to Harry, the room rearranged its attention. Harry stood and walked to the witness area. He didn't sit. He stood in it, the way he'd stood in the Wisengamot chamber, without particular drama, just occupying the space fully. "Lord Potterblack," Whitmore said. "We'd like to hear from you about the impact of the sealed inheritances. Not the legal dimension, we've covered that, but the practical one. Your experience." Harry looked at the committee. "I went to Gringotts for the first time when I was 11, he said. I stood in Vault 687, a vault I wasn't told existed because it was sealed. I stood in Vault 687, no. I stood in Vault 713. He stopped. Corrected himself. "I stood in my family's main vault and I didn't know that 90% of what I should have been standing in was inaccessible. I was told that vault was the Potter Vault. I accepted that because I had no reason not to." He looked at the committee. "I had no reason not to accept most of what I was told, because I was a child and children accept the reality they're given." He paused. "I fought a troll at 11. I faced a possessed defense teacher. I went into the Chamber of Secrets at 12 with a plan that was mostly hoping for the best. I fought my way through a maze at 14 to a port key that delivered me to a graveyard where Voldemort was resurrected." He listed these flatly, without emphasis, because they didn't need emphasis. "I did all of that at 31% capacity. Not because I chose to. Because I didn't know there was more." He met Valentina Marchetti's eyes specifically. "I'm not saying this for sympathy. I'm saying it because the question was about practical impact, and practically, I could have been better prepared for all of it. Not just better resourced. Better prepared. The sealed memory vessels from my parents, which I accessed last week for the first time, contained information that would have been relevant. Information about the war. About Voldemort's methods. About the specific magical techniques he'd used against my family." He stopped. "I got that information at 16. My parents left it for me before they died." The room was absolutely still. "Thank you, Lord Potterblack," Whitmore said quietly. Harry nodded and went back to his seat. Hermione's hand found his under the table and gripped it once, quick and firm, and let go before anyone could see it. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. The committee's preliminary findings were issued that afternoon. The seals had been placed in excess of guardian authority under the 1834 precedent. The full legal review would continue, but the preliminary finding was sufficient to formally censure Dumbledore's specific actions in regard to the sealed inheritances. He was formally removed from any remaining guardian authority over Harry, which was largely academic at 16, but mattered as legal record. His position as Hogwarts headmaster was noted as separate from the guardian authority question and not subject to the committee's current scope, which several people in the room had opinions about but which was, for now, correct procedure. Dumbledore received the finding standing, in the committee room, after everyone else had left. Harry had stayed, not sure why, and watched the old man take the formal censure document from a ministry official and sign the acknowledgement. When the official left, they were alone in the room. Dumbledore looked at the document in his hands for a moment, and then he set it on the table beside him and looked at Harry. "I would like to say something," he said. "Not a justification. Not an explanation. Just, something." Harry waited. "I have watched you for 16 years, Dumbledore said. Longer, I watched your parents, and I knew what you would be before you were born. And in all of that watching, I made the mistake that people who love something too carefully sometimes make." His voice was even and quiet. "I confused protecting you with shaping you. I thought they were the same thing. They are not. Protection would have given you everything you needed to survive and trusted you to survive it. What I did instead was decide what you could handle, and adjust the world accordingly." He paused. "I would have done better if I had trusted you the way you deserve to be trusted. I am sorry that I did not." Harry looked at him for a long moment. "I know," he said. "I know you know," Dumbledore said. I wanted to say it directly regardless. Harry nodded. He picked up his robes from the chair and made to leave, and then stopped. Turned back. The information you offered. About the ritual history of the seals. Gripclaw told me it arrived by letter, the same day we left your office. You wrote it immediately. I did. That information accelerated the consolidated claiming by at least a week. Harry looked at him. I wanted you to know that I know that. Dumbledore held his gaze. Something in the old face shifted, not relief exactly, not the reduction of guilt, more like the slight adjustment that happens when a burden is not lifted but at least acknowledged by someone other than the person carrying it. Thank you, Dumbledore said. Harry left the room. He walked out into the ministry corridor and found Ron, Hermione, and Neville waiting, not anxiously, just present, leaning against the opposite wall in various attitudes of patient alertness. He looked at them, the three of them, and felt something that was deeply ordinary and deeply important simultaneously, gratitude, the kind that doesn't need to be said because it lives in the fact of someone being there. How are you? Hermione asked. He thought about the honest answer. Strange, he said. But okay. Strange as in. Strange as in it's done and it didn't feel like I thought it would feel and I don't know yet what I feel instead. He paused. But okay. Ron nodded, accepting this completely. Food, he said, with the practical certainty of a person who understood that most feelings were more navigable after eating. Food, Harry agreed. Voldemort's response to Harry's letter arrived that evening. It appeared on the kitchen table at Grimmauld Place while they were eating, between one moment and the next, in the same letterless way as the first. Harry picked it up and read it while the others watched. It was shorter than the first letter. One paragraph. Tomorrow night. 11 o'clock. The location is a memory, you have the Slytherin claiming now, and with it, access to a specific form of old ancestral connection that can carry you to a neutral space if you know how to use it. You know more than you think you do. The phrase is in Parseltongue. If you can find it, you'll arrive safely. If you can't, the offer stands until you can. I read the preliminary findings of the Wisengamot inquiry. The system that was supposed to protect you was the thing that diminished you. I told you this would be of interest. T.M. Riddle. Harry set the letter down. He's using the Slytherin connection, he said. There's apparently a Parseltongue phrase that activates some kind of ancestral meeting space. A neutral ground. He looked at Hermione. Old magic. She'd gone the specific color she went when she encountered a magical concept she hadn't read about and was experiencing something between frustration and fascination. I've read references to it, she said carefully. Very old references. The founders apparently had meeting spaces that weren't physical locations, they existed as magical constructs anchored to bloodline connections. If the Slytherin claiming gave you access to his ancestral network, then Voldemort has had access to it his whole life, Neville said, thinking out loud. He knows how to use it. He's inviting Harry into it. He looked at Harry. That's either genuine or an extremely elegant trap. If it's a trap, I can handle it, Harry said simply. And if it's genuine, I need to be there. Harry, Ron started. I know the risks. He looked at all of them. I'm not going because I trust him. I'm going because talking to him directly is more useful than not talking to him, and because I think, he stopped. I think he's genuinely curious. I think he's encountered something this week that his model of the world didn't account for and he needs to understand it. He paused. I want to look at him across a table and say what needs saying. That matters. Regardless of what he does with it. And if he tries something, then whatever he tries happens to someone who has 40 houses of ancestral magic in their bones, Harry said. Including his own house. He looked at Ron specifically. I'm not afraid of him. I want you to understand that's not bravado. I'm genuinely not afraid of him. What I am is clear about what needs to happen, and one of the things that needs to happen is this conversation. Ron stared at him for a long moment. Then he exhaled through his nose and picked up his fork. "If you're not back by midnight," he said, "I'm coming in after you, and I don't care how old the magic is." "I'll be back by midnight," Harry said. "I know," Ron said. "I'm just stating a fact. For the record. In case the records come up later." "Gringotts keeps records," Harry said. "Exactly," Ron said, and ate his dinner. At 10:30 Harry sat on the floor of the Grimmauld Place drawing room with the door closed and the lights low and tried to locate what the Slytherin claiming had deposited in him. It was the deep water cold, the old ancestral magic that sat differently from the others, not in his chest like the Potter ring or his bones like the Gryffindor connection, but in the back of his throat, in the place where Parseltongue lived. He closed his eyes and felt for it the way you feel for a word in a language you've known forever but haven't used recently, and it was there, had always been there, a texture of awareness that was the Slytherin line, 9 centuries of snakes and silence and the particular variety of intelligence that had always characterized Salazar Slytherin's descendants. The phrase, when it came to him, didn't come in English. It came in Parseltongue, not a translation of English words but a native construction, the language generating it directly, as if his own ancestral connection to the line knew what was needed and produced it. It felt like unlocking something with a key you'd had in your pocket the whole time. He spoke it. The room didn't change. He didn't move. But something did, some quality of the space he was sitting in shifted, the way light shifts when a cloud moves, and then he was somewhere else that was also where he'd been a moment ago, the way a reflection is in a mirror but isn't. The meeting space was simple. 2 chairs facing each other across a low table. Stone floor, stone walls, no visible light source but everything perfectly visible. The air had the deep water cold of the Slytherin ancestral magic, and sitting in the chair across from the one he'd arrived in front of was Tom Riddle. Not Lord Voldemort. Not the inhuman figure from the Department of Mysteries or the graveyard. Tom Riddle, the face he'd seen in the diary at 12, the brilliant handsome face of what the man had been before he'd made himself into something else. He still looked like that here, in this ancestral space, as though the old magic of the Slytherin line didn't recognize the thing he'd done to himself and showed him in the form it remembered. He was watching Harry with eyes that were dark and sharp and absolutely, completely intelligent. And something else. Something Harry had not expected. He was, in some deep and very carefully managed way, impressed. Harry sat down. "Lord Potterblack," Riddle said. "Lord Riddle," Harry said. Something moved across the other man's face, not surprise exactly, but the recognition of a choice. Harry had met him at his own level of honesty and they both knew it. "You found the phrase," Riddle said. "It came to me. The Slytherin claiming is thorough. It is." Riddle looked at him with the steady focus of someone cataloging data. "You're not afraid?" "No. Of any of this?" "The space." "Me." "The conversation?" "No," Harry said. Riddle leaned back slightly in his chair. "I find that interesting rather than threatening. I want you to know that." "I know," Harry said. "That's why I'm here." They looked at each other for a moment, the two of them, in this constructed space outside normal reality, in the ancestral cold of a house line that had deposited itself in both of them in different ways and for different reasons. Riddle was measuring him with the analytical eye of someone who had spent decades learning to assess threats and was now encountering something that didn't fit the threat category and hadn't yet found the correct filing system. "The letter you sent me," Riddle began. "The trap dressed as insight line." "Yes." He paused. "You've already thought through my argument." "Before I made it." "It wasn't difficult to anticipate," Harry said. "You're going to point at every broken thing in the wizarding world, the institutional bias, the suppression, the way the people who were supposed to protect me were the ones who diminished me, and you're going to say, see, the system doesn't work, I'm the alternative. And some of what you'll point at will be genuinely broken. I know that. The sealed houses are real. Dumbledore's choices are real. The structural problems in the Wizengamot are real. He held Riddle's gaze. But you are not the alternative. You're not offering a better system. You're offering yourself, your judgment, your rule, your version of who deserves power, in place of the broken system. That's not an alternative. That's the same problem with a different face. Riddle was quiet for a moment. His expression was, remarkably, not defensive. It was the expression of someone who has been told something they already know and is listening to how someone else says it. And your alternative, he said. I'm building it, Harry said. I have 19 Wizengamot seats and 40 houses and considerably more time ahead of me than you do, given what you've done to yourself. He said this last part without cruelty, just factually. I'm going to fix the broken things properly. Not by replacing one person's authority with another's. Riddle looked at him for a long moment. You're 16, he said. Not disparagingly. Observationally. You were 17 when you opened the Chamber of Secrets, Harry said. You were 22 when you made your first Horcrux. Age is irrelevant, Riddle said, and something moved across his face that might have been, impossibly, amusement. Fair point. They sat in silence for a moment. The ancestral cold of the Slytherin line moved through the air like a slow current. I'm not going to stop, Riddle said. Not as a threat. As an honest statement of his own nature, the way someone states a fact about themselves that they've long since accepted. What I've set in motion, the network, the plans, the specific objectives, they don't stop because you've reclaimed your inheritance and impressed me. I know, Harry said. And you're not going to stand aside. No. Then what was the point of this? Riddle said, and his voice had something in it that was, Harry listened carefully, something almost like genuine curiosity. Not tactical curiosity. Real. So that when we end this, Harry said, we both know it was between two people who could see each other clearly. Not a prophecy. Not a myth. Not the Dark Lord and the Chosen One. Just, he paused. Two people who could have been something else, under different circumstances, and chose what they chose. He looked at Riddle directly. I wanted you to see me properly. All of it. I wanted to see you the same way. He paused. I do, now. And I still know exactly what has to happen. Riddle held his gaze for a long moment. The war, he said finally. The war, Harry confirmed. But on my terms now. Not yours. Not Dumbledore's. Mine. Something in the space shifted, not the magic, not the temperature, but some quality of the air between them. Riddle looked at him with the sharp dark eyes and the face the old magic remembered, and for just a moment there was something in it that went past intelligence and strategy and the monstrous weight of his own choices, something that might have been, in another life, recognition. The acknowledgement of something equal. Lord Potterblack, Riddle said. Lord Riddle, Harry said. They both stood at the same moment, which was not something either of them had planned, and it was the most honest thing that had happened in the conversation. Harry walked out of the ancestral space the same way he'd walked in, and the drawing room resolved around him, the low light, the furniture, the sound of the house around him. He sat for a moment, completely still. Then he pulled out a fresh piece of parchment, picked up a quill, and began writing. Not to Riddle. To Gripclaw, and to Valentina Marchetti, and to every lord and lady who had voted with him in the Wizengamot chamber. A long letter, specific and direct, outlining what he wanted to do next and what he needed from each of them to do it. He wrote for 2 hours. Hermione appeared at the door at midnight exactly, as she always did, because Hermione kept time the way Gringotts kept records. She looked at him, the rings on his hand, the stack of letters, the focused calm of his expression, and she sat down across from him and picked up a quill. Tell me what you need, she said. He told her. They worked until 3 in the morning. Chapter 6, Lord of What Was Always Mine. The plan took 11 days to build and 37 minutes to execute. Harry spent those 11 days moving through 3 countries, 7 ancestral seats, and more conversations with more people than he'd had in the entire previous year combined. He went to the Scottish borders for the Carrow Ashworth seat, not the Death Eater Carrows, a different branch entirely, older and quieter and represented by a 70-year-old witch named Edith who'd been waiting for the Potter heir with a patience that had curdled slightly over the decades into a very specific kind of dry readiness. He went to Brittany for the Delacroix secondary house that connected to his maternal French ancestry, which Fleur Delacour's family received with a formal dignity that was also unmistakably warm. He went to a valley in Wales for House Murden's ancestral seat, which was a cairn of stones on a hillside that looked like nothing and was everything, the oldest magic he'd touched yet, older than Hogwarts, older than the Ministry, old in the way that the landscape itself was old. He brought Ron and Hermione for the Scottish seat. He brought Neville for Wales. He went to France with just Gripclaw, who had decided somewhere around day 4 that personally accompanying the process was both professionally necessary and, Harry suspected, personally satisfying in a way the goblin would have declined to articulate. Each ancestral seat visit broke another cluster of seals. By day 8, 36 houses were fully claimed. By day 10, all 40. The last one, a minor English house called Penfold with a single vault and a crumbling folly in Somerset, broke in Harry's sleep on the 10th night, and he woke at 4 in the morning with the feeling of something very large becoming complete, the final stone of a wall settling into mortar that had been waiting for it. He lay in the dark and felt the full weight of himself for the first time. It wasn't like anything he had words for, not exactly. It was the feeling of 37 doors all open simultaneously, 40 houses present in him like 40 instruments in an orchestra that had been playing with most of the sections silent for 15 years and was now, all of it, every part, playing. Not louder. Fuller. The difference between a recording and the actual concert hall. He got up, dressed quietly, and went downstairs and sat in the grim old place kitchen and made tea and looked at nothing in particular while the house breathed around him, old and renovated and his, genuinely his in a way that had taken 2 weeks of work and 9 centuries of ancestry to make real. He thought about his parents. Not in the grief-weight way he'd carried them for years, the heavy absence of them, the shape of the whole. He thought about his mother's memory vessel warmth and her voice saying you are more than I had time to tell you. He thought about his father's jaw in the mirror. He thought about Sirius's blue sky certainty in deposited crystal, if you're hearing this I didn't make it and I'm sorry, but here's what I found. They'd all tried to leave him what they could. Across whatever distance separated them, they'd tried. He put the thought away carefully, not suppressing it, just giving it its right place, important and present and not in the way of what needed doing. He picked up the plan. Valentina Marchetti had described it, when Harry had laid it out for her over tea in her townhouse on day 6, as audacious, probably correct, and the kind of thing that requires everyone involved to be excellent at exactly the right moment, which is my least favorite kind of plan. Then she'd spent 2 hours improving it. The intelligence from the riddle conversation had been more useful than Harry had initially realized. Not because Riddle had said anything directly revealing, he hadn't, and Harry hadn't expected him to. But the conversation had given Harry something more valuable than intelligence, a clear view of how Riddle was thinking. The man had spent 30 years building a network designed for a particular kind of war, infiltration, fear, the steady corruption of institutions. He was not, Harry had understood sitting in that ancestral cold, prepared for what Harry was actually going to do. Because Harry wasn't going to fight the network. He was going to make it irrelevant. The specific plan had 3 components that needed to happen in sequence on the same night. The first was Wisengamot. The second was Gringotts. The third was Riddle's primary stronghold, a location Harry had identified through a combination of Sirius's deposited research, a tip from Cassius Malfoy who had delivered it without ceremony and without asking for anything in return except to be left off the attendance list for the actual event, and a piece of information from the Slytherin ancestral connection that Harry had spent 2 days learning to use properly. The Slytherin ancestral magic was, in the end, the thing Riddle had not accounted for. He'd offered Harry access to it thinking it was an olive branch, a show of good faith, or possibly a trap. What he hadn't considered was that Harry would use it to listen, that the same ancestral connection that allowed the Parseltongue meeting space also allowed a sensitivity to the Slytherin network's magical signature, a kind of geographic awareness of where the line's strongest resonances were. Finding the stronghold had taken 3 days of careful, quiet attention, sitting with the deep water cold of the Slytherin claiming and following it the way you follow a current back to its source. The stronghold was in Northumberland. An estate that had been abandoned on paper since 1998 and occupied in magical reality for the past year. Harry had kept the location to himself until day 9, when he'd shared it in a room containing only Ron, Hermione, Neville, Gripclaw, Valentina Marchetti, and Dumbledore. He'd invited Dumbledore because of what the old man had said in the inquiry room and because of what he'd said when they were alone afterward, and because Harry was not interested in conducting the endgame of a war with a powerful ally on the bench for reasons that were more about Harry's feelings than about what was tactically correct. He'd knocked on the headmaster's office door himself on day 7 and said, straight out, I want your help with the final piece. Not because I need it. Because you know things about Voldemort that are directly relevant and keeping you out of the room when I'm planning around those things is stupidity dressed as principle. Dumbledore had been quiet for a moment and then stood up and said, I'll get my coat. The planning meeting had been the best strategic conversation Harry had ever been part of. Marchetti's political precision, Dumbledore's encyclopedic knowledge of Riddle's history, Gripclaw's logistical efficiency, Hermione's penetrating analysis, Neville's emerging instinct for the gap between what a plan assumed and what reality would produce, Ron's absolute reliability for finding the thing everyone else had missed and stating it simply, all of it together in one room, around the Grimmauld Place kitchen table with tea and creatures biscuits and maps spread across every available surface. By the end of the meeting, the plan had been stress-tested against 17 different failure modes and had survived all of them with modifications. Now it was day 11, 11:40 at night, and Harry was standing in a Northumberland field with 37 people behind him and the full weight of 40 houses in his bones. The assault group was not large and was entirely intentional about not being large. 37 people, chosen for specific reasons, each one someone Harry had looked at directly and decided could be excellent at exactly the right moment. 6 Aurors, led by Proudfoot, who had been quietly furious about the ministry's state for 2 years and had been waiting for something that looked like it might actually work. 8 members of what had been the Order of the Phoenix who had the combination of skill and reliability that the situation required, Remus Lupin among them, who had arrived at Grimmauld Place on day 9 and gripped Harry's arm without speaking and then spent 2 days helping refine the combat strategy. Neville, who had trained every day for 2 years and had been quietly devastating in every practice session Harry had watched him in. Ron and Hermione, obviously, without any question, because some things didn't require justification. 4 Goblin fighters from Gringotts' security division, who had agreed to participate not because Gringotts took sides but because, as Gripclaw had explained, we have a long institutional memory about what happens when dangerous people are permitted to continue operating and we have decided to express an opinion about this one. And Dumbledore. Standing slightly apart, in his deep plum robes, wand in hand, with the particular quality of readiness that very old, very powerful wizards have, not tense, not eager, just present in a way that was completely total. The estate's wards were visible to Harry in a way they wouldn't have been 2 weeks ago. He could see them as patterns in the magical landscape, the way you can see current in moving water if you know what to look for. Riddle's wards were good. They were actually very good, the product of someone who understood defensive magic at a level that most people didn't reach. 3 layers, perimeter detection, a physical barrier ward keyed to a specific magical signature, and an inner alarm system that would alert the inhabitants on magical entry. Harry had a way through all 3. The Slytherin ancestral connection meant he read as inside the signature the barrier ward was keyed to. He was Slytherin's heir. He walked through the ward the way you walk through a door with the right key, not breaking it, not tripping it, simply being recognized as having the right to be on the other side. He turned back and looked at the 37 people. The perimeter ward goes down in 40 seconds once I'm through, he said, quietly. Don't move until it does. The alarm system is the one that needs to be hit simultaneously at 3 points, Hermione, Lupin, Proudfoot, you know your positions. Once the alarm goes down, the first priority is the Death Eaters in the East Wing. There are 14 of them by current intelligence, possibly more. Orders take East, Order takes the central structure. He looked at Neville. You're with me. Neville nodded. He had his wand already out and an expression of complete calm that was, Harry thought, one of the most striking things about Neville Longbottom in the last year, how thoroughly he'd grown into his own readiness. Riddle is in the tower, Harry said. Northwest corner. I'm going there directly. I'm not asking anyone to come with me for that part. But I need everyone to handle everything else well enough that I can focus on it without having to watch the rest of the battle. We'll handle it, Ron said. Not a promise delivered with drama. Just a statement of fact. Harry looked at him for a moment. Ron had his wand in his right hand and his chin up and was looking back at Harry with the unwavering directness of someone who had decided a very long time ago that wherever Harry was going, Ron was making sure Harry got to go there. I know, Harry said. He turned and walked through the ward. It recognized him exactly as he'd expected, a subtle ripple in the magical pressure, a brief warmth as the Slytherin ancestry moved through the ward's recognition mechanism, and then he was on the other side, standing in the estate's grounds with the dark shape of the manor ahead and the ward intact behind him. He moved quickly to the first junction point and did what Hermione had carefully worked out over 2 days of reference checking, applied a specific counter-ward technique from House Murden's ancestral combat knowledge to the perimeter detection layer, dismantling it from the inside in a sequence that took 38 seconds. The perimeter ward collapsed. He heard the movement of 36 people behind him. The next 4 minutes were the thing you trained for and planned for and then experienced as being both exactly like the plan and entirely its own thing. The East Wing lit up with the light and sound of combat almost immediately as the Aurors went in. The central structure's alarm went down in a coordinated 3-point hit that was textbook precise, which meant Hermione, Lupin, and Proudfoot had hit their marks inside 2 seconds of each other. Someone sent a very large blasting hex into the main gate's hinges that Harry was fairly sure was Ron, because Ron had been practicing it. Harry and Neville moved for the northwest tower. They got 30 yards before the first intercept, 2 Death Eaters coming out of a side door, fast and aggressive, the kind of fast that meant they'd been warned and had their orders. Neville took the first one so smoothly and completely that the man was down before Harry had registered Neville's wand moving. Harry took the second with a binding combination from the Selwyn ancestral line's combat magic that he'd been practicing for 3 days and that worked the way it was supposed to, cleanly and decisively. Front door. Neville said. Side entrance, Harry said, pointing to a narrow door in the tower's base. Less observed. It was locked with a ward that was specifically Slytherin keyed, which was almost thoughtful of Riddle, Harry decided. He walked through it the same way he'd walked through the perimeter ward. The tower's interior was stone steps winding upward, lit by the same torch-style enchantments that characterized everything about the estate, old-feeling, intentionally so, Riddle's aesthetic preference for things that felt ancient even when they weren't. Harry went up the steps fast with Neville behind him, and the sounds of the battle below filtered up through the stone, muffled but present, the indication that 35 other people were doing their part. The door at the top of the stairs was not warded. Harry put his hand on the handle, looked back at Neville. I need you on this side of the door, he said. Not because I need backup. Because someone needs to make sure this door stays clear. Neville looked at him steadily. I know, he said. Go. Harry opened the door and went in. The tower room was large and circular and bare in the way of someone who had long since stopped needing things to be comfortable. A chair. A table with several objects on it Harry chose not to look at directly. A fireplace that was burning too evenly to be wood. Windows on 3 sides, showing the Northumberland dark outside and, in the distance, the lights of the battle in the main building. Riddle was standing at the central window. He'd heard Harry on the stairs, clearly. He was turned to face the door before Harry was through it, and he was, in this physical reality, in this body he'd rebuilt through magic that had cost him more than he'd ever admit, not the Tom Riddle face that the ancestral space showed. He was what he'd made himself into, tall, pale, the face stripped of the features the Slytherin line remembered, the eyes flat red in the firelight, the physical presence of someone who had made themselves into a weapon at the cost of everything that had made them human. But he'd read Harry's letter. He'd sat across from Harry in the ancestral cold. He'd received 15 seconds as information about what he was dealing with. And Harry could see all of that in the way he was standing. He was ready, he was dangerous, and he was also, for the first time in possibly 30 years, uncertain. Not afraid. Riddle wouldn't allow fear. But uncertain. Revising. Lord Potterblack, he said. Lord Riddle, Harry said. Your network is being taken apart floor by floor downstairs. I have 6 Aurors, 8 Order members, 4 Gringotts fighters, and Albus Dumbledore. In about 20 minutes, everything down there is done. He looked at the man across the room. That's not why I came up here. Riddle's red eyes moved over him with the sharp assessment Harry had seen in the ancestral space. Why did you come up here? To finish this, Harry said. Here. Between us. Not in a graveyard. Not in a ministry atrium. Not through a prophecy that neither of us consented to be part of. He stepped further into the room. I told you in the ancestral space, this was going to be on my terms. I meant that. You think you can end this tonight? Yes. You're 16, Riddle said, and this time there was something in it, not dismissal, something more complicated, something that might have been the specific ache of a person recognizing something true they hadn't wanted to be true. The magic you've claimed is real, but you've had it for 11 days. I've had mine for 30 years. The Peveril line is older than 30 years, Harry said. The Slytherin line is older than 30 years. The Gryffindor connection has been building since I was 11 and sat in his hall and belonged to it in a way that the ancestral magic recognized before I did. He paused. And I had mine sealed and suppressed for 15 years and I still got here. Imagine where I'm going. Riddle looked at him for a long moment. You're going to make me the case study, he said quietly. For what happens when power is misused. The sealed houses, the institutional corruption, the war, you're going to build your alternative using the wreckage of what I've done and what was done to you as the evidence for why it needs to exist. Yes, Harry said. Precisely. That's actually, Riddle stopped. Something moved across the inhuman face, something the features could barely accommodate anymore, something that had once been what you saw on a brilliant boy's face when he encountered an idea that genuinely impressed him. That's actually very good, he said. I know, Harry said. You're not going to offer me terms. No. Or mercy. I'm going to offer you, Harry said carefully, the chance to do this without causing any more damage to the people downstairs. That's not mercy. That's efficiency. Riddle was quiet. Outside the windows, the battle sounds were diminishing. Not because it had gone wrong, because it was ending. 35 people doing their jobs with the excellent precision of a plan that had been built well. I have Horcruxes, Riddle said. It was almost, Harry listened to the quality of it, it was almost testing. As though he was checking whether Harry knew. 5 left, Harry said. The diary was destroyed in my second year. The ring was destroyed by Dumbledore. The locket was destroyed last year in the Forest of Dean by Ron. The cup is in a Gringotts vault that Gringotts has already accessed under the legal authority of the Inheritance Review. He met Riddle's eyes. The snake is outside. Neville has specific instructions. He paused. And the fragment in me has been gone since I understood what it was and used the Peveril connection to excise it. 3 weeks ago. It was the first thing I did with the ancestral claiming, before we left London. Something happened in Riddle's face. The revision was visible, the model updating in real time, the chess player looking at the board and understanding the sequence of moves that had already been completed while he was watching a different part of the game. The Peveril line, he said quietly. The Master of Death connection. Mastery of death isn't what everyone thinks it is, Harry said. It's not power over death. It's understanding it. Being at peace with it. He looked at Riddle directly. You're afraid of it. You've always been afraid of it. And the fear made you into this. He gestured, simply, at the room, the body, the 30 years of accumulated choices. You were brilliant. You could have been extraordinary in a different direction. I genuinely believe that. Riddle stared at him. I know, he said, finally, and the two words were the most honest thing Harry had ever heard from him. Not self-pity. Just, the acknowledged weight of a road taken that could not be untaken. Harry raised his wand. Tom, he said, and used the name deliberately, because names mattered and this one was the truest one, the one the Slytherin line knew, the one that existed before everything else was layered on top of it. It's done. The battle was brief and completely serious and Harry fought it with everything he had, all 40 houses, all the ancestral combat magic, the Peveril depth and the Gryffindor clarity and the Slytherin cold precision all moving through him simultaneously in the specific way they'd learned to work together over 11 days of claiming and practicing, not competing, each one doing what it did best in the moment it was needed. Riddle was everything Harry had known he would be, 30 years of accumulated mastery, genuine genius in motion, the specific ferocity of someone who had nothing left to lose and knew it. But Harry had something Riddle didn't. He wasn't afraid of what came after. The Peveril connection had given him that, not recklessness, not death-seeking, but a genuine, bone-deep understanding that the thing on the other side of risk was not an abyss but simply what came next, and what came next for Harry specifically was the 40 houses and the 19 Wisengamot seats and the work of building something that deserved to exist. The fear was just, not there. In its place was clarity. And clarity in a magical duel is worth approximately 3 years of extra training. The end, when it came, was not spectacular. It was a counter to a curse that Riddle threw in the 23rd second of the duel, a counter that came from House Murden's ancestral line, a deflection and return technique that was 300 years old and had been designed specifically for the category of magic Riddle was using, because someone in the Murden line had faced something similar once and had worked out the answer. The magic returned on Riddle's own arc, precise and complete, and it hit him the way finality hits, not dramatically, not with theatrical consequence, but with the specific weight of something becoming permanently, irreversibly done. Tom Marvolo Riddle died in a tower in Northumberland on an August night and the last thing he saw, Harry thought, was someone who had looked at him and seen him clearly and had not flinched from what they saw and had done what needed to be done anyway, without hatred, without triumph. With something more like the determined sadness of someone finishing a thing that should never have needed to begin. Harry stood in the room for a moment afterward. Then he went back to the door and opened it. Neville was there, on the landing, exactly where Harry had left him. He looked at Harry's face and said nothing, which was precisely correct. He simply stood aside. They went down the stairs together. Outside, the estate was quiet in the way that places go quiet after large things are done in them. The Aurors had Death Eaters bound and documented. Lupin was checking on 2 people who'd taken curse hits that were treatable and being treated. The goblin fighters were already in conversation with Gripclaw, who had apparently arrived at some point during the battle, because of course he had. Proudfoot was writing something, probably the most significant incident report of her career, with the focused efficiency of a person who understood that documentation was the mechanism by which events became history. Ron was sitting on a low wall at the estate's edge eating a biscuit from somewhere. Harry had no idea where the biscuit had come from and this seemed entirely appropriate. He walked over and sat next to Ron on the wall and Ron handed him half the biscuit without comment. Harry ate it. Done. Ron said. Done, Harry said. Ron nodded. He looked out at the estate, the damaged gates, the lit windows where people were working. How do you feel? Harry thought about it honestly, in the way he'd been making himself think about things honestly for the last 2 weeks. Strange again, he said. But different strange. Less, unfinished. Good strange. Yeah, Harry said. I think so. Hermione appeared from around the side of the building and came directly to where they were sitting, read Harry's face in the way she always read his face, rapidly, accurately, with all the warmth of someone who cared very much what she found there, and sat on his other side. She didn't say anything either. The three of them sat on the wall in the August dark and let the quiet be quiet. After a while Neville came and sat nearby, and then Lupin drifted over, and then Gripclaw appeared and stood at a slight distance. That was Goblin, for I am participating in this moment while maintaining professional dignity, and the group of them existed in the comfortable silence of people who have been through something large together and are letting it settle. Dumbledore came last. He walked across the estate grounds in his plum robes, his wand put away, his half-moon glasses catching the light from the windows. He stopped a short distance from the wall and looked at Harry, and Harry looked back at him, and something passed between them that was not forgiveness. It was too early and too complicated for anything that clean, but was something real nonetheless. The acknowledgement of two people who had occupied the same story differently and were both still in it, both still responsible for what came next. "It's done," Dumbledore said quietly. "It's done," Harry said. The old man nodded. He looked up at the sky. "Northumberland gave you a remarkable amount of sky, dark and wide and full of things that had nothing to do with the wars of small creatures on the surface below them." "Then we begin," he said. "We've already begun," Harry said. The weeks that followed were the kind of complicated that Harry had been bracing for and was still somewhat surprised by in its specific texture. The ministry moved fast once the Death Eater arrests came in, 32 people from the Northumberland estate alone, plus the 17 who'd already been held since the Diagon Alley incident and the ongoing Auror sweeps that Proudfoot had been running with considerably more political backing now that the Wisengamot balance had shifted. The trials started in September and were conducted with a transparency that the system had been too compromised to manage the last time around. Harry testified in 4 of them. He was direct, specific, and refused every attempt by defense counsels to make the testimony about his own history or his own nature or the sealed houses or anything other than what he'd actually witnessed. Marchetti sat in the observer's gallery for all 4 and watched like a hawk and seemed, each time, to be updating some internal document. Hogwarts opened on September 1st. Harry went, because not going would have been a different kind of statement than the one he wanted to make, and because there was actual work to do. He had new preparation and 2 years of course curriculum and the considerably more interesting project of being in a school where he now understood what he was and didn't need anyone else to tell him. He sat in the Hogwarts Great Hall on the first morning back and looked up at the enchanted ceiling, September blue and scattered with the early clouds of autumn, and felt the castle around him the way he'd always felt it, like a familiar that had chosen him. The Gryffindor banner above the house table. The warm noise of 800 students eating breakfast and catching up on their summers. Ron had piled his plate with extraordinary ambition, which was normal. Hermione had 3 books open simultaneously while eating toast, which was also normal. Neville was talking to Hannah Abbott 3 seats down with the slightly flustered quality of someone managing the intersection of genuine feelings and newly acquired political standing, which was a newer normal. Dumbledore sat at the head table. He looked, different from the beginning of summer, Harry thought. Not diminished. The opposite, almost, like someone who had set down a thing they'd been carrying for a long time and found, without it, that they were lighter but also more present. Less managed. He caught Harry's eye across the hall and raised his cup slightly, a small gesture that was privately between them, and Harry inclined his head. The rings on his right hand caught the enchanted light from the ceiling. McGonagall appeared at Harry's shoulder mid-breakfast, wearing the expression she wore when she had something to say that she intended to say privately but hadn't found a better moment. She leaned down. "Professor Dumbledore and I have been in discussion with the Board of Governors," she said quietly, in her crisp Perthshire voice. "Given the Wisengamot seat situation and the ongoing legislative workload, the school is prepared to offer you accommodation for any necessary ministry days during term. Flexible scheduling, within reason, for the Lord's obligations." Harry looked up at her. "Thank you, Professor." She straightened. "Don't thank me. I simply find it expedient that our students maintain their academic standing while also, apparently, reshaping the wizarding government." A pause. "Also, Lord Potterblack." She said the title with a precision that was also, he thought, a private acknowledgement. Well done. She went back to the head table. Ron, who'd been close enough to hear, said nothing, which meant he was saving it. Harry knew the specific silence. It would come out later as something perfectly timed and slightly ridiculous, which was how Ron processed things that were large and good. Hermione had looked up from her books during the McGonagall conversation and was now looking at Harry with the expression she reserved for moments she intended to remember accurately. She didn't say anything either. She just looked, and in the looking was everything: the leaky cauldron table 2 weeks ago, the granite room underground, the Wisengamot chamber and the inquiry room and the Northumberland field, all of it compressed into a look that said we did this in a particular way that really meant you did this and we were with you. He nodded at her. She nodded back and returned to her books. Gripclaw's end-of-week letter arrived at breakfast by Gringotts Owl, charcoal-colored, disdainful, depositing the envelope with professional efficiency and leaving without a treat. The letter confirmed that the consolidated claiming was fully registered, that all 40 vaults were accessible and active, that the Inheritance Review Committee had formally adopted the 1834 precedent as binding in all subsequent sealed inheritance cases, and that House Penfold's crumbling Somerset folly was eligible for heritage preservation funds if Harry chose to apply, which Gripclaw recommended with a dry efficiency that Harry suspected contained genuine enthusiasm. He folded the letter, put it in his pocket, and reached for his breakfast. At some point, he was aware, there would be more. More sessions, more legislation, more of the long patient work of building the things that deserve to exist. The magical world was not fixed by a night in Northumberland. It was started, tilted, the way you tilt a stuck thing so that gravity can take over, and the work that came after was going to take years and would require the exact combination of stubbornness and clarity and the particular quality of being entirely oneself at full size that Harry had spent 16 years not knowing he had. He was ready for it. Not because everything was resolved. Not because the broken things were mended. Because he knew who he was now, all the way down, 40 houses deep, 40 names in his bones, his mother's voice and his father's jaw and serious as blue certainty woven through everything, and a Potter ring warm on his finger, and a black ring answering it, and all the others layered underneath like the deep water that the surface doesn't show but is entirely real. He picked up his fork. Next to him, Ron said, "Oi. Pass the bacon." Harry passed the bacon. The enchanted ceiling went on being September above them, and the house tables hummed with the ordinary irreplaceable noise of people existing together, and somewhere in the ministry a piece of legislation was moving through committee with 19 votes from one person's hand, and somewhere in Gringotts a ledger was open with 40 names written in the permanent ink that Gringotts used for things that were not going to change. Lord of what was always his. Beginning.